Part 7, The Discourse Disruptor, the X Acquisition and xAI 2022-2023. Chapter 61. The Acquisition, from largest shareholder to owner. He walked into Twitter's San Francisco headquarters, carrying a bathroom sink. The image, Musk crossing the lobby of a company he had just purchased for $44 billion, holding a porcelain sink with the expression of a man who had planned this joke several days in advance and was committing to it with the total investment of someone who did not do things halfway, traveled around the world in the specific way that images travel when they compress into a single frame, something that 1,000 words of analysis have been trying and failing to capture. The caption he posted with it, "Let that sink in," had the quality of humor that lands not because it is clever. It was not particularly clever, but because it arrives at exactly the moment when the thing it is commenting on is large enough and strange enough that the absurdity of the joke is actually the most honest available response to the situation. The situation was this. The richest man in the world had just bought one of the most consequential public communication platforms in human history on what had begun as an impulse, metastasized into a legal commitment he had spent 6 months trying to escape, and concluded with his walking through the door of a building full of people who had spent those same 6 months watching their professional futures become hostage to his changing moods. The sink was a prop. What it was propping up, the idea that this was a performance, a bit, something with a lightness that the gravity of the situation did not actually warrant, was the question that the employees watching from behind their laptops were beginning to understand would define the next chapter of their working lives. The sink arrived on October 26, 2022. By October 28th, the chapter had already begun. To understand how Musk arrived at the threshold of Twitter's lobby carrying a sink, you have to go back not to April 2022 when the offer was made, but to the preceding years during which his relationship with the platform had evolved from user to activist to finally, the kind of owner who buys a thing partly because he loves it, and partly because he cannot stand what it is doing with itself. Musk had been an active and strategically significant Twitter presence since at least 2018, using it to announce Tesla production milestones, to mock short sellers, to recruit engineers, to muse about taking Tesla private in a tweet that cost him a settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and a temporary surrender of his chairmanship of Tesla's board. Twitter was, for Musk, not a marketing tool in the conventional sense. It was a cognitive environment, a place where his thinking happened in public, where the feedback loop between his ideas and the world's response to them ran faster than any other medium he had access to, and where the specific quality of attention he received was calibrated to his actual interests rather than the interests of the journalists and analysts who mediated his public image elsewhere. He had also, across those years, developed a set of convictions about what Twitter was doing wrong, convictions that were partly ideological, partly aesthetic, and partly rooted in his own experience of a platform that had, in his view, allowed a particular political and cultural sensibility to shape its moderation decisions in ways that distorted the public discourse it claimed to be hosting neutrally. The banning of Donald Trump in January 2021 had crystallized this conviction for him, not necessarily because he supported Trump. His relationship with Trump was, in this period, complicated and evolving, but because the act of a private platform removing a sitting president from its service represented, in his analysis, an exercise of editorial power so consequential that it could not be reconciled with the platform's self-description as a neutral public square. The world in which Musk began accumulating Twitter shares in early 2022 was a world in the middle of several simultaneous crises that had both elevated the political importance of social media platforms and intensified the debate about who should control them. The war in Ukraine, which began in February 2022, and which Starlink was already playing a role in supporting, had demonstrated with sudden clarity how dependent modern geopolitical events were on the information infrastructure that platforms like Twitter provided. The January 6th Capitol riot had produced ongoing reckonings about the relationship between social media and political violence. The COVID pandemic had generated years of conflict about what constituted misinformation and who had the authority to define and suppress it. These were not abstract policy debates. They were live controversies that had organized significant portions of the American public into opposed camps with incompatible convictions about the most basic questions of epistemology, not just what was true, but who got to decide. Musk entered this environment with the specific confidence of a man who had solved problems of considerably greater technical complexity than running a social media company, and who had concluded, through a process of reasoning that he found transparent and others found alarming, that the problems of Twitter were fundamentally problems of courage and conviction rather than problems of engineering. The platform needed to be less afraid of speech. It needed to be more transparent about its moderation decisions. It needed to rebuild the trust of the half of the political spectrum that had concluded, with evidence that Musk considered substantial, that the platform's definition of acceptable discourse was systematically tilted against conservative viewpoints. These were, in his framing, correctable problems, the kinds of problems that yielded to the same direct intervention that had corrected production rates at Fremont and engine yields at McGregor. This framing would prove, in the years ahead, to be one of the most consequential miscalculations of his career. But in the spring of 2022, it felt to him like clarity. He began buying shares in January 2022, quietly, through the kind of accumulation that significant investors in public companies are required by law to disclose once they cross the 5% threshold. When the disclosure arrived on April 4th, it revealed that he had accumulated approximately 9.2% of Twitter's outstanding shares, making him the largest individual shareholder, a position he had reached without any public announcement, and with a filing that was itself late by the standards the SEC required, a lateness that would later cost him a financial settlement. The sequence, silent accumulation, mandatory disclosure, immediate public consequence, had the structure of a move in a game that Musk had planned several turns in advance. Whether the game he was playing was the game Twitter's board thought he was playing, was the question that would consume the next 6 months. Twitter's board offered him a seat. He declined. Then, on April 14th, he offered to buy the entire company for $54.20 per share, a price that represented a significant premium to the pre-announcement trading price, and that was structured in the documentation submitted to the SEC as a best and final offer. The letter he sent to the board stated that he did not believe Twitter could be transformed in the ways it needed to be transformed as a public company, where the pressures of quarterly earnings and advertiser relationships and shareholder optics would constrain exactly the kinds of decisions that needed to be made without constraint. He needed to own it outright. He needed to take it private. And he was prepared to pay $44 billion to do so. The core conflict of this chapter was not the negotiation over price. The board ultimately accepted the offer, and the acceptance came faster than most hostile acquisition processes resolved, in part because the premium was real, and in part because the alternative of a prolonged battle with the world's most prominent and most unpredictable billionaire was a scenario that Twitter's institutional shareholders found less attractive than the certainty of $54.20. The conflict was the one that developed in the weeks and months after the acceptance, as Musk began the process of due diligence that preceded closing and discovered, or claimed to discover, the distinction would become legally significant, that Twitter had misrepresented the scale of its bot and spam account problem. The bot question was, in one sense, a narrow technical matter. Twitter had disclosed to regulators and investors that fewer than 5% of its monetizable daily active users were fake or automated accounts, and Musk contended that the real figure was substantially higher, which would mean the company he had agreed to buy was worth substantially less than the price he had agreed to pay. In another sense, it was a convenient vehicle for a reconsideration that had deeper roots, a growing recognition, as the reality of ownership approached, of the gap between the Twitter he had imagined transforming and the Twitter that actually existed with its legacy infrastructure, its advertiser dependencies, its deeply embedded organizational culture, and its regulatory exposure across dozens of jurisdictions with incompatible definitions of acceptable online content. In May of 2022, Musk announced that the deal was on hold pending resolution of the bot question. In July, he formally attempted to terminate the agreement. Twitter sued him in the Delaware Court of Chancery to enforce the original terms. The litigation that followed was, by the standards of corporate law, unusually public and unusually personal, both sides filing documents that contained private communications, internal analyses, and the kind of candid assessments that parties to negotiations typically assume will remain confidential, each filing producing a news cycle of coverage that kept the story at the top of the technology press for months. The revealing action of this entire episode, The single decision that most clearly illuminates the character operating beneath the strategy was not the original offer, and not the attempted withdrawal, but the moment in October 2022 when Musk, facing a trial date that the Delaware court had set and that legal analysts were widely assessing as likely to go against him, abruptly reversed course and offered to proceed with the acquisition at the original price. He framed the reversal as a decision to close the deal on its original terms, rather than face the uncertainty of litigation. What it revealed was something more fundamental. A man who, having stared at the actual consequence of losing a legal battle over a contract he had signed, had concluded that owning Twitter on the terms he had agreed to was preferable to the alternative, and who had made that calculation in approximately the time it takes most people to decide what to have for lunch. The person whose role in this chapter most clearly reveals the relational texture of the acquisition was Parag Agrawal, Twitter's CEO, who had been running the company for less than a year when Musk's accumulation of shares became public, and whose tenure ended abruptly and without grace on the night of October 27th, when Musk arrived at Twitter's headquarters and Agrawal was escorted from the building he had been leaving moments before. Agrawal had attempted, in the months between the offer's acceptance and its closing, to manage the company through a period of extraordinary uncertainty, a period in which every significant strategic decision had to be made under the shadow of an imminent ownership change whose terms and timeline kept shifting. He had frozen hiring, paused projects, tried to hold together an organization whose institutional confidence was draining with each new Musk tweet about the company's failures. His relationship with Musk had deteriorated in the public record of their communications, from the formal courtesy of a new owner and the incumbent CEO to something considerably more hostile. Musk posting a poop emoji in response to an Agrawal thread explaining Twitter's bot methodology, a gesture that communicated, with the economy of a single Unicode character, the entirety of his assessment of the man he would shortly be paying $50 million to remove. The poop emoji was not, in the register of serious business communication, serious. It was also not nothing. It was Musk telling Agrawal and everyone watching exactly how much institutional respect he intended to extend to the organizational conventions of the company he was acquiring, which was to say approximately none. When Musk walked out of the Delaware courthouse, having committed to close the deal, and then walked into Twitter's San Francisco lobby carrying the sink, the sequence communicated something that the legal filings and the financial analysis had not quite managed to convey, that what was happening was not, in his own interior experience, primarily a business transaction. It was something more personal, a takeover of a platform that he had loved and resented and used and been used by for years, now finally brought under the control of the person who believed, with the conviction of someone who had never encountered a system he could not improve by owning it outright, that he knew what it needed to become. The employees who watched him walk in with the sink would, within 48 hours, watch half their colleagues receive termination notices. The advertisers, who had been waiting to see how the transition unfolded, would, within weeks, begin pausing campaigns at a rate that would define the financial reality of everything that followed. And somewhere in the platform's server infrastructure, in the years of accumulated decisions about content and community, and the specific social contract between a platform and its users, were consequences of the changes he was about to make that no one, not Musk, not the departing executives, not the lawyers in Delaware who had spent months litigating the question of whether the deal would close, had yet begun to fully imagine. Chapter 62. The Hardcore Purge, 75% Staff Reductions. The mattresses arrived on a Thursday. Not metaphorically. Actual mattresses, rolled and wrapped in plastic, hauled through the service entrances of Twitter's San Francisco headquarters at 1355 Market Street by men in gray uniforms who said nothing to the engineers watching from the mezzanine. By the time the sun had set over the bay, several of them had been leaned against the walls of conference rooms on the fourth floor, beside whiteboards still marked with the product roadmaps of a company that no longer quite existed. Someone had written, in blue dry erase marker above one of them, "Welcome to the Hotel Twitter." The joke spread through Slack within minutes. Most of the people laughing at it would be gone before the punchline finished echoing. Elon Musk had taken formal possession of Twitter on October 27, 2022, having closed a $44 billion acquisition that he had spent the better part of 6 months attempting to escape. He walked into the building carrying a white porcelain bathroom sink, grinning for a photographer he had clearly anticipated would be there, and posted the image to the platform he now owned with the caption, "Entering Twitter HQ, let that sink in." It was a pun so deliberately terrible, so aggressively self-satisfied, that it functioned less as a joke than as a declaration of intent. The new owner of the world's most politically combustible media platform had announced himself the way a conqueror plants a flag, not with solemnity, but with the theatrical contempt of a man who believed that the people he was displacing had never truly understood what they were building. To understand what followed, it is necessary to understand not just the building Musk entered, but the world pressing in on it from every direction. By the autumn of 2022, the American information landscape had become a contested, exhausted, and deeply fractured terrain. The midterm elections were weeks away. The war in Ukraine was grinding into its 8th month, and the battle over its narrative, who was winning, who was suffering, what the West owed, was being fought in real time on social media platforms that had themselves become geopolitical instruments. The prior 4 years had produced a global reckoning about the power of digital speech. January 6th had happened, Donald Trump had been deplatformed, COVID misinformation had killed people, and the question of who should govern public discourse had become one of the defining ideological confrontations of the era. Silicon Valley, long accustomed to framing itself as a neutral utility, had been forced to choose sides, and the choosing had made it hated by nearly everyone. Twitter, specifically, occupied a singular and strange position in this landscape. It was not the largest social network. It had never come close to Facebook's scale, but it was where journalists wrote and were written about, where politicians floated trial balloons and absorbed incoming fire, where the tone of the national conversation was set before it migrated anywhere else. Its roughly 7,500 employees had grown up in the culture of late-period Silicon Valley liberalism, earnest about content moderation, committed to a particular vocabulary of harm and safety, and convinced, not without reason, that the decisions they made in their product reviews and trust and safety meetings had consequences that rippled far beyond their open-plan offices. Many of them believed they were doing meaningful work. Many of them believed that Elon Musk was a chaos agent who would burn it down. Both things were about to be tested against reality. The core conflict Musk faced was not, as he often framed it publicly, a simple matter of engineering efficiency, of stripping a bureaucratic machine down to its functional load-bearing walls. It was something far more treacherous. He was attempting to simultaneously restructure a going concern, re-engineer its culture, satisfy the terms of a debt-laden acquisition that required the company to generate cash it had never consistently generated, and do all of it while being the most watched man on the platform itself. He was the product manager, the press release, and the product all at once. No one had ever done anything quite like it, and there was no manual for the specific kind of failure it invited. Within 48 hours of taking control, he fired the 4 most senior executives, including CEO Parag Agrawal, CFO Ned Siegel, and the head of legal policy Vijaya Gadde. He escorted them out personally, or rather had them escorted out, their badges deactivated before they reached their cars. In the days that followed, his team began auditing headcount with the particular enthusiasm of men who have decided in advance what the audit will find. Twitter had, by most objective analyses, grown its staff aggressively during the pandemic years without a proportionate growth in revenue. This was true. It was also true that the solution Musk reached, eliminating approximately 75% of the workforce in a matter of days, was less a surgical correction than an amputation performed without anesthesia, without a clear map of the patient's anatomy, and with a degree of confidence in the surgeon's instincts that the subsequent bleeding would repeatedly call into question. The layoffs came in waves, each one preceded by the particular anxiety of people refreshing their email and their badge access simultaneously, discovering which had stopped working. Engineers who had maintained core infrastructure, the systems that kept tweets from disappearing, that routed notifications, that prevented the platform from collapsing under the weight of the World Cup or a presidential debate, received the same termination emails as diversity program coordinators and middle managers whose functions were genuinely redundant. Several critical systems wobbled. Some engineers who had been let go on a Friday received calls by Sunday asking them to come back. A number refused. Others, calculating the severance against the chaos, agreed. It had the texture, one former employee later said, of a factory fire in which the owner kept insisting the smoke was a feature. The word Musk kept returning to, in emails and all-hands addresses and posts that functioned as both internal memos and public performance, was hardcore. He sent the email on November 16, 2022, to the remaining employees. They could click a link to affirm their commitment to working long hours at high intensity to build a breakthrough Twitter, or they could take 3 months of severance and leave. He gave them until 5 p.m. the following day. Roughly 1,000 people, including many of the senior engineers his new lieutenants had identified as essential, chose the severance. The cafeteria on Market Street reportedly fell quiet, in the way that spaces fall quiet when the people who gave them their noise have gone. Musk, who had by then taken to sleeping in the building, reportedly responded to the departures with something between frustration and resolve. He had expected attrition. He had not, by some accounts, expected this much of it, or from these particular people. The anecdote that cuts most cleanly to the character of what Musk was doing in those weeks, the keyhole moment, the gesture that reveals the larger architecture of the man, occurred not in a boardroom or an all-hands meeting, but in the code itself. In the early days after the takeover, Musk and his inner circle, a rotating group that included engineers from Tesla and SpaceX, as well as a cadre of young, intensely loyal technologists who called themselves the team, held informal performance reviews of Twitter's engineering organization. The methodology was blunt. They printed out the code contribution histories of individual engineers, assessed the line counts, and used these printouts as a proxy for productivity. Senior engineers with decades of experience, who had spent their recent years on system architecture, on documentation, on the invisible connective tissue of a complex platform, showed low line counts. Some were marked for dismissal. It was, to anyone with a serious background in software engineering, a nearly comical misreading of how large-scale systems are actually built and maintained. Lines of code are not widgets. An engineer who writes 50 lines that prevent a catastrophic data race is worth more than one who writes 5,000 lines that add noise. When some of the remaining senior engineers attempted to explain this, they were met with varying degrees of receptiveness, depending on who in Musk's orbit happened to be in the room. One engineer, by multiple accounts, printed a counter document, a technical brief explaining what certain low-line count engineers were actually responsible for, and walked it into the review session himself. He kept his job. Others did not bother, or did not have anyone willing to carry the brief on their behalf. What the episode revealed was not stupidity. Musk is not stupid, and his instinct that Twitter had been protecting underperformers within a culture allergic to accountability was not wrong. What it revealed was the specific shape of his intelligence. Pattern matching at extraordinary speed, impatient with the friction of institutional knowledge, and most dangerous when his confidence in his own first-order analysis outpaced his curiosity about what he did not yet understand. He had built rockets. He had built cars. He believed, at some foundational level, that engineering was engineering. The problem was that Twitter was not just an engineering problem. It was a social infrastructure problem, a political problem, a trust problem, an advertising market problem, and a human organization problem, all welded together into a system whose complexity revealed itself only in failure. And Musk was, in those first weeks, generating a great deal of instructive failure. The key relationship that crystallized during this period was not with any of the employees he was dismantling, but with the man who had been his longest-standing technologist. Jared Burkle, his family office manager and quiet organizational nerve center, coordinated the logistics. But the more revealing relationship was with his own public self, with the version of Elon Musk that existed on the platform he now owned. He posted constantly, at all hours, with a freedom that could only belong to someone who had internalized the fact that there was no longer any corporate communications team positioned between his thumbs and the world. He trolled. He mused. He amplified accounts that mainstream journalists found alarming. He posted memes and asked his followers to weigh in on major policy decisions via polls, whether to reinstate Trump, whether to offer amnesty to suspended accounts, as though governance of a global information platform were a call-in radio program. His critics saw it as recklessness bordering on malevolence. His defenders saw it as the most radical transparency a media proprietor had ever offered. Both interpretations were partially correct, and neither captured the extent to which Musk was, in those weeks, living entirely inside the logic of a machine he had just purchased and did not yet fully control. The advertisers were watching. This is the fact that the mattresses and the memes and the midnight tweets obscured deliberately. Twitter's business model depended with uncomfortable totality on advertising revenue that was itself dependent on brand safety, on the predictability of the environment in which ads appeared, and on the confidence of the chief marketing officers at Fortune 500 companies that their products would not appear beside content that would generate a news cycle. As Musk fired the trust and safety teams, as he gestured toward loosening content moderation, as he became himself the most controversial content on the platform, those chief marketing officers began making calls. General Motors paused its advertising within hours of the acquisition closing. Others followed. IPG, one of the largest advertising holding companies in the world, advised its clients to consider suspending Twitter spending entirely. Musk publicly called out specific executives by name, accused them of attempting to destroy free speech through economic coercion, and implicitly threatened consequences. The executives did not respond publicly. They did not need to. Their budgets were already moving. By December, the platform was still standing, still sending its 500 million daily tweets, still hosting the conversations that no other platform had managed to replicate, still stubbornly and against all structural logic functioning. But functioning and thriving are different conditions, and the men who had lent Musk the money to make this purchase, banks holding roughly $13 billion in debt, secured against a company that was now hemorrhaging advertising revenue and engineering talent simultaneously, were beginning to study their term sheets with the particular attention that creditors bring to a borrower who has started making the news every day. What none of them had fully accounted for, what the spreadsheets and the analyst notes and the brand safety audits could not quite contain, was what Musk intended the platform to become once he had finished tearing it down to its studs. The layoffs, the hardcore ultimatum, the mattresses on the conference room floors, these were not, in his telling, acts of destruction. They were the preconditions of something else, something larger and stranger and more consequential than a restructured advertising business. He had begun, in private conversations and in the oblique telegraphing of his public posts, to speak about X, not the company, not yet, but the idea. A single platform. An everything app. A digital public square that was also a payments network, a communications infrastructure, a place where money and speech and identity collapsed into a single account, a single interface, a single point of control. The employees who had left with their severance checks did not know what was coming. The advertisers who had paused their campaigns did not know what was coming. Even the engineers sleeping on those conference room mattresses, grinding through the integration tasks Musk had assigned them in 12-hour shifts, could not have fully known. But somewhere in the overlap between his ambition and his recklessness, between the chaos he had unleashed and the vision he had not yet articulated clearly enough for anyone outside his own mind to evaluate, the thing he actually wanted was beginning to take shape, and it would require building something that had never existed before, on the ruins of something he had just spent $4 billion trying to prove was broken. Chapter 63. Rebranding to X, the vision for the Everything app. The bird came down in the middle of the night. Not gradually, not with ceremony, just gone between 1 hour and the next, the way a word disappears from a language when the last person who knew it stopped speaking. The Twitter logo, that round-cheeked blue silhouette that had been the ambient symbol of a decade's worth of political upheaval and cultural argument and human noise, was removed from the facade of 1355 Market Street sometime in the early hours of July 24, 2023. Workers on scissor lifts unbolted it in the dark while San Francisco slept, and by the time the city's commuters arrived with their coffee the following morning, the building that had housed the world's most volatile public square wore, in the Bluebird's place, a white X, illuminated, enormous, blinking at irregular intervals with a strobing light that neighbors would later describe in complaint letters to the city as resembling an airport beacon or a distress signal, depending on their disposition toward the man who had ordered it installed. Elon Musk posted the letter X to his own feed that morning. Nothing else. No explanation, no press release, no prepared statement. The post received millions of impressions within the hour. He did not appear to need language. The symbol was the announcement, and the announcement was also a provocation. And the provocation was also, in the specific grammar of how Musk communicated with the world, a kind of dare. Try to tell me this is wrong, the blinking X seemed to say to the journalists already sharpening their copy, to the brand consultants already recording their podcasts, to the shareholders of publicly traded competitors already watching their tickers. Try to tell me this doesn't work. It had been 8 months since he walked through the door with the sink. 8 months that had compressed, in the way that catastrophes and transformations both compress time, into a period that felt simultaneously like a decade and like an afternoon. The man who had fired 3/4 of the staff, slept on conference room floors, and turned the platform's content moderation policies into a running public argument conducted in real time on the platform itself, had not, as his critics had predicted in November, driven Twitter into the ground. The platform was wounded, structurally compromised in ways that would not be visible until they were catastrophic, and hemorrhaging the advertising revenue that had been its financial spine. But it was alive. It was, in fact, more discussed than it had ever been, which was a different thing from healthier, though Musk had a particular gift for inhabiting the gap between those two conditions as though it were solid ground. The world into which he launched this rebrand was one in which the politics of digital platforms had become fully and openly a proxy war for something larger. Meta had spent the prior year launching Threads, a direct Twitter competitor, with the specific energy of a company that sensed an opportunity in the chaos of a destabilized rival. TikTok was fighting congressional hearings about its Chinese ownership with one hand and accumulating 1 billion users with the other. The regulatory environment in Europe, where the Digital Services Act had just taken effect, was imposing content moderation obligations on large platforms that Musk publicly regarded as incompatible with his conception of free expression. In Washington, both parties had found reasons to be angry at social media companies, though they were angry about different things, and proposed solutions so mutually contradictory that the net legislative effect was paralysis. The information ecosystem, in the summer of 2023, was at once more regulated and more anarchic than it had ever been, more scrutinized and more ungovernable, and Musk had positioned himself with characteristic deliberateness at its most exposed and contested intersection. He had, in those 8 months, done something that conventional business analysis struggled to categorize. He had made the platform's dysfunction inseparable from his own persona, so that the story of Twitter was always also the story of Elon Musk. And the story of Elon Musk was always being told on Twitter in a recursive loop that generated engagement with the reliability of a perpetual motion machine and the sustainability of one. This was either genius or a catastrophic conflict of interest, dressed in genius's clothing, and the honest answer was that it was both simultaneously in proportions that shifted by the week. The core obstacle Musk faced in this chapter was not technical. The engineering challenge of building a so-called everything app, a single platform combining social communication, financial transactions, identity verification, long-form content, short-form video, and artificial intelligence, was formidable but not categorically beyond the capabilities of a well-resourced technology organization. The obstacle was conceptual, and it lived in the space between what Musk believed Twitter could become and what Twitter actually was. The everything app was not his phrase originally. He had spoken admiringly in interviews stretching back years of WeChat, the Chinese super app developed by Tencent that had, within the specific regulatory and cultural and economic conditions of China, become the operating system of daily life for over 1 billion people. You paid your rent on WeChat. You hailed taxis, ordered food, filed government paperwork, sent money to your parents, read the news, and conducted your romantic life, all within a single application that had made itself so indispensable that to exist outside it in Chinese urban life was to be functionally invisible. Musk wanted that. He had wanted it, he told people, since before he bought Twitter, had seen in the platform's existing network of accounts and attention, and habituated daily use the raw material from which a WeChat for the Western world might be constructed. The problem, which people who had studied the WeChat phenomenon attempted at various points to explain to him, and which he received with varying degrees of receptiveness, was that WeChat had not been built. It had grown inside a specific regulatory greenhouse, a Chinese internet sealed from foreign competition, a government that mandated its use for official services, a payments infrastructure that had been built from scratch around a system that had no entrenched credit card incumbency to displace. The conditions that produced WeChat were, in almost every meaningful structural sense, the opposite of the conditions that existed for an American social media platform trying to add financial services in an environment with entrenched payment processors, skeptical banking regulators, state money transmission licensing requirements in all 50 states, and a user base that already had 17 other apps on their phone and would delete yours before breakfast if it gave them the slightest inconvenience. Musk knew this, or knew enough of it to acknowledge the friction. What he believed, what he had always believed about rockets and cars and tunnels, was that the friction was an argument for moving faster, not slower. That the institutions and incumbents and regulatory frameworks arrayed against the thing he wanted to build were obstacles to be routed around, rather than forces to be negotiated with. It had worked at SpaceX, where the aerospace establishment's certainty that reusable rockets were economically impossible had turned out to be a failure of imagination rather than physics. It had worked at Tesla, where the automotive industry's conviction that mass-market electric vehicles were a decade away had been revealed as a failure of will rather than engineering. He applied the same template to X. The incumbents were wrong. The regulators were slow. The critics were invested in the status quo. Move fast. The revealing action, the specific gesture that cracks open the chapter's larger argument, came not in the rebrand announcement itself, but in what Musk did to the domain name. Twitter.com had been for 15 years one of the most valuable pieces of digital real estate on the internet. Its brand recognition was global. Its URL was embedded in hundreds of millions of pieces of printed material, in the metadata of countless articles and academic papers and legal documents, in the muscle memory of users who had typed it so many times that their fingers knew the keystrokes before their conscious minds had formed the intention. On July 24, 2023, Musk redirected it. Twitter.com now resolved to x.com, a domain he had owned since 1999, the URL of the online bank he had founded before it merged with a competitor to become PayPal, the domain he had repurchased from PayPal in 2017 for reasons he described at the time as sentimental but which were in retrospect clearly architectural. He had been planning this, in the way that he planned things, not with a linear project schedule, but with the sustained patience of someone who accumulates the components of a vision over decades and assembles them when the conditions are correct. X.com was not just a URL. It was, in Musk's personal mythology, the original expression of a specific ambition, the idea, formed in the early internet era when everything seemed possible and nothing seemed built, that a single digital platform could handle all of a person's financial life. PayPal had realized a small piece of that vision, and then, under management that prioritized consolidation over expansion, had failed to realize the rest. Musk had never forgiven the failure. Not because he was sentimental about the company. He had been forced out of PayPal's board before it went public, but because he was sentimental about the idea. X.com was the original container for a vision that had been interrupted. Redirecting Twitter to it was not rebranding in the conventional marketing sense. It was resurrection. It was Musk insisting, with the particular stubbornness that has been both his greatest productive force and his most reliable source of unintended consequence, that the story he had started in 1999 was not finished. The relationship that defined this period most acutely was the one that had been forming, through a series of compounding dependencies and mutual accelerations, between Musk and Linda Yaccarino, the former NBC Universal advertising executive he appointed as CEO of X in May 2023, 2 months before the rebrand. Yaccarino was, in almost every relevant biographical dimension, Musk's opposite. She was a career media executive, a relationship builder, a woman who had spent decades earning the trust of the brand managers and agency heads whose budgets Twitter needed to survive. She wore Chanel to meetings. She spoke the language of brand-safe environments and premium content partnerships with the fluency of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where those phrases were the operating currency. She believed, genuinely, in the possibility of stabilizing X's advertising business, of convincing the CMOs who had paused their spending that the platform could be made predictable enough, safe enough, trustworthy enough for their brands to return. What made the relationship revealing was not its tension, the obvious tension between a professional stabilizer and a congenital disruptor, but the way Musk appeared to understand at some level that he needed exactly the thing he was temperamentally least likely to provide. He could not be the person who reassured Procter & Gamble's marketing department. He could not sit across a conference table from a brand safety consultant and speak their language without the kind of contempt breaking through that ends meetings. Yaccarino could do all of those things, and Musk had hired her knowing it. But the hire contained a structural paradox that no organizational chart could resolve. She was being asked to sell stability in an institution whose owner was its most destabilizing force, to promise predictability to advertisers while the man above her on the org chart was liable at any moment to post something that would light the news cycle on fire and send the brand safety alerts cascading through the agency's inboxes before she'd finished her first coffee. The partnership was genuine, and it was also impossible, and both things would be tested continuously in the months that followed. She took the job anyway. This said something about her ambition. It also said something about the gravitational field Musk generated. The way that proximity to the scale of what he was attempting could make the risks feel smaller than they were, could make the impossibility feel like an argument for the size of the eventual reward rather than an argument for caution. People around Musk had been making this calculation for 20 years. Most of them were right enough of the time to stay, and wrong enough of the time to be scarred. The blinking X on the building was eventually ordered removed by the city of San Francisco, which cited improper permitting. Musk's team took it down after 4 days without comment. A smaller, non-illuminated version replaced it. The neighbors filed their complaints with the language of disrupted sleep and quality of life concerns, which were real, but which were also a remarkably apt metaphor for what X had become in the broader culture, something that pulsed too bright and too irregularly, that was impossible to ignore and difficult to live beside, that was neither gone nor stable, and that no one could quite agree on whether to fight or accommodate or simply wait out. The payments infrastructure that Musk had promised, the financial rails that would transform X from a social media platform into something with the ambition and the architecture of WeChat, had not yet materialized. The licenses were being applied for state by state, in the way that large regulatory undertakings actually proceed, which is to say slowly and without fanfare, and against a timeline that bore no relationship to the speed at which Musk operated or the urgency with which he spoke. The AI integration he intended to braid into X's core experience was being developed, separately by a company he had incorporated in March 2023 and named xAI, a venture staffed by researchers he had recruited from DeepMind and Google Brain and OpenAI, an organization he had co-founded a decade earlier and then departed in circumstances that had left, in the people who remained there, a residue of unresolved feeling that was about to become something considerably more complicated than professional disagreement. The Everything app was still, in the summer of 2023, mostly a declaration. But declarations in Musk's history had a way of becoming structures, and the structure he was now building, across X and xAI and the broader architecture of his attention, was drawing toward it a specific kind of confrontation with the people and institutions that had spent the prior decade building the very technology he intended to compete with, displace, and, if his ambitions ran to their logical conclusion, surpass. Chapter 64. Content Moderation and the Free Speech Absolute. He read the spreadsheet, the way a general reads a casualty report. It was late in the evening. It was always late in the evening in those months, time having lost its conventional architecture inside the building on Market Street, and the document on the screen in front of Elon Musk contained, in columns and rows of clinical precision, the accounts that his new trust and safety team had flagged for potential reinstatement. Names that had been removed from the platform under the prior administration's policies. Names that carried, in the American political atmosphere of late 2022, the specific radioactive charge of a debate that had never actually been about the names themselves, but about what the names represented, about who had the authority to determine the boundaries of acceptable public speech, about whether a private company moderating its own platform was exercising editorial judgment or committing an act of censorship, about whether the people who had built the Internet's public squares had a right to decide who was permitted inside them and who was not. Musk scrolled. His expression, by the accounts of people who were present in those sessions, was not triumphant. It was focused, in the way that a man is focused when he believes he is correcting an injustice, and the correction requires concentration rather than celebration. He had not bought Twitter to rehabilitate specific banned accounts. He had bought it, Or so the internal story went, the story he told himself and repeated publicly with the consistency of a man who needs his own mythology to hold, because he believed the platform had become something it was never supposed to be, a curated environment in which a particular ideological sensibility had hardened into institutional policy, in which the decision-makers on content and moderation had imported their priors so completely into the machinery of the platform that the machinery itself had become partisan. He believed this with the total conviction of someone who has decided that a thing is true, and thereafter encounters all contrary evidence as proof of the conspiracy rather than complication of the thesis. Whether he was right or partially right or right in ways that his remedies would catastrophically overshoot, this was the question that the coming months would answer, slowly and painfully and very publicly, on the platform he now owned. The world into which Musk was conducting this experiment was one that had spent years tying itself into philosophical knots over the governance of digital speech, and had resolved none of them. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the legal provision that shielded platforms from liability for user-generated content while permitting them to moderate that content as they chose, had become a political football kicked with equal ferocity from both ends of the ideological field. Conservatives argued that the platforms used their moderation immunity to suppress right-leaning speech while claiming neutrality. Progressives argued that the platforms, in their pursuit of engagement and revenue, had allowed their systems to amplify extremism, harassment, and disinformation far beyond what any responsible publisher would have permitted. Both arguments contained genuine evidence. Neither argument contained a solution that its proponents could implement without immediately generating the exact harms they claimed to oppose. In Europe, the Digital Services Act had imposed a new regulatory architecture on large platforms, requiring systematic risk assessments, transparency and algorithmic recommendation, and meaningful mechanisms for users to contest content moderation decisions. The European Commission was watching X with particular attention. The platform had, in the Commission's assessment, been slower to comply with the DSA's requirements than its counterparts, and the regulator's patience was not unlimited. In Washington, the Senate and House committees that had made a practice of summoning Silicon Valley executives for theatrical hearings had a new target, though Musk had demonstrated with characteristic efficiency that he had no intention of performing the ritual of the congressional apology. He would not sit before a committee and express, in the careful language of pre-approved legal testimony, his commitment to doing better. He would post about the committee on X instead, and his post would receive more attention than the hearing. The core conflict was this: Musk had articulated a vision of free speech that was philosophically coherent at the level of abstraction and operationally incoherent at the level of implementation. His stated principle was that speech should be legal unless it was illegal, that the platform should remove content that violated the law and leave everything else alone. It was a position with genuine intellectual heritage, rooted in classical liberal philosophy, in the First Amendment tradition that had shaped American jurisprudence for 2 centuries, in the belief that the answer to bad speech is more speech rather than enforced silence. John Stuart Mill would have recognized the argument. So would the ACLU of 30 years prior. The problem was that illegal is not a content moderation policy. It is a legal determination that requires jurisdiction-specific analysis, that varies across the 180 countries where X operated, that is subject to litigation and interpretation and change, and that provides no guidance whatsoever on the vast middle category of content that is not illegal but is, in the judgment of the advertisers whose spending sustained the platform, the researchers who studied radicalization, the civil society organizations that monitored hate speech, and the ordinary users who simply wanted to use the platform without being targeted, genuinely harmful. A platform that moderates only illegality is a platform where a great deal of content that most people would find repugnant is permitted to flourish, because most repugnant content is technically legal. Musk's critics understood this immediately. His defenders argued that discomfort with legal speech was not a sufficient basis for its suppression. The argument was real, the stakes were real, and neither side was going to convince the other. Into this gap, Musk deployed community notes. The system had existed under Twitter's prior management under a different name, Birdwatch, and had operated as a small, experimental program in which a self-selected group of volunteer contributors could add contextual notes to potentially misleading tweets. Musk expanded it, accelerated its rollout, and elevated it rhetorically to the centerpiece of his content governance philosophy. Rather than a team of employees making top-down decisions about what was true and what was false, Community Notes distributed the fact-checking function across a large crowd of contributors whose notes only appeared when people with diverse political perspectives reached consensus. The mechanism was genuinely clever. It had a philosophical elegance. It operationalized the Millian premise that truth emerges from open competition among perspectives, and it did so in a way that was transparent, auditable, and resistant to the single point of failure problem that had plagued centralized moderation teams. When it worked, and it did work, in cases where the factual question was clear enough and the contributor pool large enough and motivated enough to converge, it produced corrections that were more credible than anything a company-employed fact-checker could generate, because they carried the implicit endorsement of ideologically diverse participants. When it didn't work, it produced something else entirely. A system that was too slow for rapidly spreading misinformation, that was gameable by organized groups willing to invest effort in the consensus mechanism, that provided no recourse for the specific and targeted harassment of private individuals who did not rise to the threshold of public interest fact-checking, and that could be pointed to by anyone seeking to spread false information as evidence that their claims were uncontested in the gap between when the note was needed and when the community managed to produce one. The distance between what Community Notes was, a genuinely interesting experiment in distributed epistemic governance, and what Musk claimed it was, a complete solution to the problem of platform misinformation, was the distance between a promising pilot program and a press release. The keyhole moment, the single action that reveals the chapter's full architecture of character, was not a policy decision. It was a post. In November 2023, in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent Israeli military campaign in Gaza, X became one of the primary vectors through which graphic content, unverified claims, and, by the documented findings of multiple research organizations, a significant volume of anti-Semitic material circulated in the Western information ecosystem. The platform's reduced trust and safety staff was visibly overwhelmed. Advertisers began again to pause spending. Yacarino made calls. And then, on November 15, 2023, a user posted a thread promoting the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jewish communities had been pushing, as the post framed it, hatred against white people. The thread accumulated engagement. And Elon Musk, the owner of the platform, the man who had positioned himself as the arbiter of a new era of responsible free expression, replied to it. His reply affirmed the post's premise. He wrote that the user had spoken what he described as the actual truth. The response was immediate and global. IBM, Apple, Disney, Comcast, Lionsgate, and dozens of other major advertisers suspended their spending on X within days. The White House issued a statement. The Anti-Defamation League, which had been in an already complicated relationship with Musk for months, he had accused the organization of unfairly damaging X's advertising revenue and had briefly appeared to threaten legal action against it, responded with a directness that left no interpretive room. Yacarino, who had spent her tenure constructing the argument that X was a brand-safe environment whose risks were manageable and whose owner was a rational actor engaged in a good-faith effort to balance expression and responsibility, was left with nothing to say that the post had not already unsaid. Musk, within 24 hours, posted an apology. He called the original post the dumbest he had ever made. He announced he would be visiting Israel, and he did, meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, touring a kibbutz devastated in the October attacks, meeting with families of hostages. The visit was genuine in its emotional register by most accounts. It was also, in its timing and its documentation, and its deployment across X's own platform, the work of a man who understood that a crisis of this magnitude required not just contrition but counter-narrative. The apology was real. The image management was also real. Both things could be true simultaneously, and in Musk's case they almost always were. The relationship that had been most fundamentally altered by this period was not with Yacarino, though she had been altered by it too, in ways that were visible in the increasing care with which she chose her public words. It was with the researchers and civil society organizations, the academics at the Stanford Internet Observatory, the analysts at the Center for Countering Digital Hate, the journalists at organizations that tracked platform hate speech trends, who had been publishing documentation of X's moderation failures since the earliest weeks of Musk's ownership. Musk's response to their research had followed a consistent pattern: dismissal, followed by accusation of bad faith, followed occasionally by legal threat. He had suggested, with varying degrees of explicitness, that organizations publishing negative research about X's content environment were engaged in a coordinated campaign to damage the platform for ideological or competitive reasons. Some of these organizations, he argued publicly, were themselves funded by interests that had a stake in X's failure. The researchers responded the way researchers respond, with more data. The data was not flattering. Studies from the EU's own monitoring mechanisms, from academic institutions in multiple countries, and from within X's own former policy teams found consistent patterns of increased hate speech volume in the months following the ownership change and the staff reductions. Musk disputed the methodology of each study, and in some cases the methodological objections had merit. Measuring hate speech at platform scale is genuinely difficult. The baseline definitions are contested, and the incentive structures of organizations that depend on documented platform harms for their funding and relevance are not without influence on their findings. But the cumulative weight of the documentation, from sources too numerous and methodologically diverse to be collectively dismissed, told a story that the November 2023 post had made dramatically harder to contest. What Musk had demonstrated across the arc of this period was something that was neither the vindication his supporters claimed, nor the simple villainy his detractors preferred. He had demonstrated that the problems of platform content governance were genuinely hard, harder than his critics' confidence in the prior moderation regime acknowledged, and harder than his own confidence in the free speech absolute could accommodate. Community Notes was a real contribution to the problem, imperfect and overpromoted but real. The loosening of moderation had produced both genuine expansions of political speech and genuine expansions of harassment, and the two effects were not separable in the way that either side of the debate preferred to pretend. The platform was, by most measures, more chaotic. It was also, by some measures, more honest about its chaos, less invested in the fiction that a private company's editorial choices were something other than editorial choices. None of this resolved the underlying question, because the underlying question, who should govern global public speech, and by what authority and accountable to whom, was not a question that a single man's ownership of a single platform, however dramatic and however consequential, could answer. It was the question of the era. It was the question that regulators in Brussels and lawmakers in Washington and courts in a dozen jurisdictions were attempting in their various institutional languages to address. Musk had inserted himself into the center of that question with a combination of genuine philosophical conviction and catastrophic personal example, and the result was a platform that embodied the contradiction perfectly: more free and more dangerous, more transparent and more polluted, more interesting and more exhausting all at once. The advertisers who had left in November had not all returned by year's end, and the ones who were watching most carefully were watching something that had nothing to do with hate speech policies or community notes or the ideological valence of the platform's recommended content. They were watching the balance sheets. They were watching what happens when the revenue model of a debt-laden platform collapses faster than its cost structure can be reduced, when the vision of the everything app remains vision while the bills generated by $13 billion in acquisition debt arrive with the indifference of arithmetic. And somewhere in the servers that now carried the name X rather than Twitter, in the data centers, processing the 500 million daily posts of a platform that had survived everything its owner had done to it, a different kind of reckoning was accumulating. Not the reckoning of public opinion, which Musk had learned to absorb and redirect with remarkable efficiency, but the reckoning of compound interest and advertiser flight, and a regulatory apparatus in Brussels that had just opened a formal investigation and did not share his sense of humor about what the investigation would find. Chapter 65. The Blue Checkmark, Monetizing Digital Identity. The impersonations began within hours. On November 9, 2022, 13 days after Musk had taken ownership of Twitter, and 2 days after he had launched the first iteration of what he was calling Twitter Blue, a paid subscription tier priced at $7.99 per month that included, among its features, the blue checkmark previously reserved for verified public figures and institutions. The platform began generating a category of chaos that was, in retrospect, so obviously predictable that its failure to have been predicted stands as one of the more instructive episodes in the history of technology product management. Verified accounts began appearing under the names of pharmaceutical companies, announcing that insulin was now free. A verified account, bearing the name and branding of Nintendo, posted an image that would have ended the careers of the person who actually ran Nintendo's social media. A verified Lockheed Martin account announced a halt to weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and Israel. A verified account impersonating former President George W. Bush posted content too crude to reproduce in a biography aimed at general audiences. Each of these accounts carried the same blue checkmark that had for years been the platform's mechanism for assuring users that they were reading what they believed they were reading, that the account labeled as belonging to a pharmaceutical company was in fact operated by that company. Musk was on the platform when it started. He saw the posts the way anyone on the platform saw them, in the feed, accumulating engagement, spreading with the frictionless velocity that the platform's architecture had always provided to content that provoked, amused, or outraged. His response was not, by the accounts of people close to him at the time, panic. It was closer to the expression of a man recalibrating, adjusting the variable he had underweighted, adding a constraint to the mental model. He posted that impersonation would constitute permanent suspension. He meant it. The enforcement was swift for a platform that had just eliminated most of its trust and safety staff, which is to say it was faster than nothing and slower than the spread of the posts themselves. Twitter Blue was pulled from the App Store within 48 hours, suspended before it had existed long enough to generate meaningful revenue or a meaningful user base. It would return, relaunched and revised in December. But the 48-hour collapse of the first attempt was a signal, not that the underlying idea was wrong, but that the execution had been attempted with the kind of speed that mistakes confidence for preparation. Musk had always operated this way, and had been rewarded for it often enough that the pattern had reinforced itself into a management philosophy. Move before the analysis is complete. Fix in the field. The approach had produced reusable rockets. It had also produced an impersonation crisis that made the world's largest pharmaceutical companies the subjects of fictional drug pricing announcements on a platform that millions of people used as a primary news source. The world into which this product decision landed was one in which digital identity had become one of the genuinely consequential problems of the information age. The question of who was actually speaking, whether the account purporting to represent an institution or a public figure was genuinely operated by that institution or figure, or was a bot, a parody, a foreign influence operation, or a simple bad actor, had moved from a theoretical concern to a demonstrated crisis over the preceding decade. Russian interference in the 2016 American election had been conducted partly through social media accounts of falsified identity. COVID misinformation had circulated through networks of accounts whose claimed expertise bore no relationship to their actual origins. The platforms had responded imperfectly and inconsistently by developing verification systems whose primary purpose was epistemic, to give users a mechanism for distinguishing authentic sources from manufactured ones. Twitter's legacy checkmark had been, in practice, an imperfect and somewhat arbitrary system. It was granted to public figures, journalists, activists, brands, and government officials through an opaque application process that critics had long noted reflected the biases of the people administering it. Some accounts that deserved verification had never received it. Some that had received it arguably should not have. But for all its inconsistency, the system had performed one function with reasonable reliability. It had made impersonation of major institutions and public figures genuinely difficult, because the checkmark was non-purchasable and therefore non-forgeable within the platform's own interface. When Musk replaced it with a subscription product, he did not merely change a feature. He changed the epistemic architecture of the platform, converted a signal whose value derived from its unforgeability into a signal whose value derived from its price, and discovered in the first 48 hours that $8 was not a sufficient barrier to people who wanted to impersonate pharmaceutical companies on the internet. The core conflict Musk faced in this chapter was a contradiction lodged at the center of his business logic, and it was a contradiction he had articulated clearly enough that he had no excuse for not having seen it. He needed revenue that was independent of advertising, because he had correctly identified Twitter's near-total dependence on advertising as a structural vulnerability, and because the advertisers were leaving. The subscription model was the right category of answer. The checkmark was the most compelling feature he had to offer, because it was the feature that existing users most associated with platform status and credibility. But the checkmark's value as a subscription incentive was precisely inverse to its value as a verification signal. The more people who had it, the less it meant, and the less it meant, the less incentive there was to pay for it. This was not an obscure problem. Product managers and platform economists had written about the dynamics of status signals for years. The literature on what economists call credence goods, products whose value derives from their perceived scarcity and authenticity, was not thin. But Musk had, characteristically, arrived at the conclusion he found most compatible with his existing goals, and then worked backward to a justification, rather than forward from the evidence. His public argument for the subscription checkmark was that the legacy system was itself a form of illegitimate status conferral, that it had created a lords and peasants dynamic on the platform, with verified accounts enjoying algorithmic advantages and social credibility that unverified accounts were structurally denied. There was truth in this. The legacy verification system had created a two-tiered platform in ways that were not always justified by the distinctions it claimed to encode. His solution, however, democratizing the checkmark by making it purchasable, did not flatten the hierarchy. It replaced a hierarchy based on institutional affiliation with a hierarchy based on willingness to pay, which is a different kind of inequality wearing the costume of its opposite. The revealing action came in the spring of 2023, when Musk ordered the removal of legacy verification badges from accounts that had not subscribed to X Premium, the renamed and revised version of Twitter Blue, regardless of whether those accounts represented genuine public figures, major news organizations, or institutions whose identity the platform's users had a legitimate interest in being able to confirm. The decision was implemented with a deadline, and then, in several cases, was reversed for accounts with enormous follower counts, when it became clear that the removal was generating the kind of news coverage that functioned as free advertising for the platform's critics. But for the thousands of accounts in the middle range, verified journalists, mid-sized news organizations, academics, civil society figures, the badges were stripped as announced. What followed was a moment of platform theater that Musk appeared to have anticipated and perhaps relished. The New York Times, which had declined to pay for verification on the grounds that doing so would imply an editorial endorsement of Musk's transformation of the platform, had its checkmark removed. Musk posted about it. He noted that the Times was, in his assessment, a purveyor of disinformation, that its legacy checkmark had represented a subsidy to an institution he regarded as a partisan actor masquerading as a neutral one, and that its removal was therefore not a punitive action but a principled correction. The Times did not respond publicly in kind. It continued covering X. Its reporters continued using the platform. Its institutional account continued posting. The absence of the checkmark generated in the short term more attention than its presence had in years. This was the keyhole into the larger man. Musk's decision to remove legacy verification was not primarily a revenue optimization. It was an act of editorial assertion, dressed in the language of business logic. He was using the infrastructure of the platform, the visual grammar of the checkmark, the algorithmic weightings attached to premium accounts, to reshape the credibility landscape of the platform's information ecosystem. Institutions and individuals he regarded as ideologically compromised would operate on X without the imprimatur of institutional verification, competing for credibility on terms he was setting. Institutions and individuals who subscribed, who paid, who accepted the new terms, would receive that imprimatur back. It was an extraordinary exercise of power, the more extraordinary for being conducted entirely openly on the platform itself, with a running commentary by its owner that made the intent visible to anyone paying attention. The relationship that crystallized most sharply in this period was the one between Musk and the broader community of journalists who covered him. It had never been warm. Musk had for years expressed a contempt for what he called the media-industrial complex, that was partly the authentic frustration of a person who believed he had been covered inaccurately, and partly the cultivated posture of a man who understood that positioning the press as an adversary was useful for his relationship with his audience. But the checkmark decisions and the surrounding policies, the suspension and reinstatement of journalists' accounts in late 2022, the policy changes affecting how links to certain news organizations were surfaced in the algorithm, converted a generalized friction into something more structural. Several prominent technology journalists found their accounts temporarily suspended in December 2022 after they reported on a third-party account that tracked Musk's private jet movements using publicly available flight data. Musk had ordered the original jet tracking account suspended, citing security concerns, and when journalists covered the suspension and linked to similar tracking resources, their own accounts followed. The justification given was a new policy against the real-time sharing of location information, a policy that had been announced the same day the suspensions occurred, which is to say a policy whose announcement and enforcement were simultaneous, leaving no interval in which the affected journalists could have complied. The episode generated a cycle of coverage that was, from any conventional public relations standpoint, a catastrophe. It produced a narrative about a billionaire using his ownership of a media platform to silence journalists who reported on him. And it produced that narrative on the platform he owned, which meant that the narrative and its subject were inseparable in the feed of every user who saw either. Musk appeared genuinely unbothered. This was either evidence of extraordinary psychological resilience, or of a man operating outside the feedback mechanisms that normally constrain powerful people, or both, which was usually the correct answer where he was concerned. He polled his followers on whether the suspended journalists should be reinstated. They voted yes. He reinstated them. The episode was over in 72 hours, but its residue, in the relationship between X and the journalistic institutions that covered it, in the willingness of reporters to treat platform policy announcements at face value, in the calculation of news organizations deciding whether to maintain their institutional presence on a platform whose owner had demonstrated the capacity and willingness to suspend them, persisted long after the accounts were restored. X Premium in its revised form grew slowly against resistance against the mockery of users who had grown up treating the checkmark as a status symbol, and now processed its purchasability as a kind of debasement, but it grew. By the end of 2023, the subscription product had generated revenue in the hundreds of millions of dollars, meaningful against a cost base that Musk had dramatically reduced but insufficient to replace the advertising revenue still recovering from its multiple crises. The platform had introduced additional tiers, Premium and Premium Plus, with graduated feature sets and price points, in the manner of a streaming service trying to find the price sensitivity curve of an audience that had never paid for the product before. The deeper consequence was still unfolding. The platform's information architecture, the system by which users assessed the credibility of what they were reading, by which authentic sources were distinguished from manufactured ones, by which the ambient trust that makes a public information space functional was maintained, had been fundamentally altered. Not destroyed, because the platform continued to function, and community nodes continued to produce corrections, and users continued to develop their own heuristics for navigating the new landscape. But altered in ways that would require years to fully measure, in ways that the researchers in Brussels and Stanford and Oxford were beginning to document with the patient accumulation of longitudinal data, and in ways that would become dramatically relevant when the platform found itself at the center of the next great disruption. Not a product decision or a content moderation controversy, but the intervention of a still more powerful technology that Musk himself was building in parallel in a separate company staffed by researchers who had left the institutions that were building the future to help him build a competing version of it, with goals that he had not yet articulated fully enough for anyone outside his own mind to evaluate, and with a timeline that was accelerating faster than even his closest observers had anticipated. Chapter 66. xAI, launching the Grok competitor. The servers were still warm from someone else's vision. In the spring of 2023, Elon Musk's team began acquiring a significant quantity of NVIDIA H100 GPU chips, the most powerful commercially available hardware for training large language models, the kind of silicon that had become, in the frenzied arithmetic of the artificial intelligence arms race, more strategically contested than oil or rare earth metals. The chips were ordered in quantities that attracted attention in an industry that tracks procurement the way defense analysts track weapons shipments. And they were routed initially toward X's infrastructure, at least on paper, at least for long enough that the accounting would become, in subsequent months, a source of legal dispute with Tesla's board, who would question whether hardware nominally acquired for one Musk entity had been redirected to serve another. But in those early weeks, the acquisition of the chips was itself the message, broadcast in the language that the technology industry understands most fluently, the language of capital deployment. Musk was building something. The chips told you the scale. Everything else was still inference. He sat with the numbers the way he sat with rocket telemetry, not passively, not as a recipient of staff-prepared summaries, but with the specific active attention of a man who believes that the data read correctly, and without the mediating interpretation of people whose institutional interests might color their analysis, will tell you what the data actually means. The AI landscape in early 2023 was generating data that told a story of extraordinary velocity. ChatGPT had reached 100 million users in 2 months, the fastest adoption curve in the history of consumer software. Google, whose researchers had invented the transformer architecture underlying virtually every significant large language model in existence, was executing a response to the OpenAI threat with the urgency of an institution that had been caught, despite building the technology, on the wrong side of its deployment. The race was on, and it was the kind of race that Musk recognized from the early days of SpaceX and Tesla, the kind where the window of competitive entry was closing faster than the incumbents admitted, and where the penalty for arriving second was not silver but irrelevance. What no one outside his innermost circle fully understood yet was the degree to which Musk's interest in this race was not, or not only, commercial. It was personal, in a way that commercial interest alone could not fully explain, rooted in a history with artificial intelligence that stretched back further than the current moment's excitement, and carried within it a specific unresolved grievance that had been accumulating compound interest for years. To understand what Musk was building, you have to understand what he believed he had lost. In 2015, he had been among the co-founders of OpenAI, a nonprofit artificial intelligence research laboratory established with the explicit mission of ensuring that artificial general intelligence, when it arrived, would benefit humanity broadly rather than accrue to any single company's shareholders. The founding premise was safety and openness. Research would be published, power would be distributed. No single actor would be permitted to control the technology that its founders believed would be the most consequential in human history. Musk had contributed $100 million and his name, which at the time was worth considerably more than that, in terms of recruiting the researchers that a new organization needed to attract. He had served on the board, participated in the strategic discussions, and brought to the enterprise his characteristic conviction that the thing being built was of civilizational importance, which was, in 2015, a conviction that most of the technology industry still regarded as the eccentric hyperbole of a very successful entrepreneur rather than a sober assessment of technological trajectory. He left OpenAI's board in 2018, under circumstances that the principals have described in varying and mutually incompatible terms. His own account emphasized philosophical divergence, a belief that OpenAI was drifting from its founding mission, that its relationship with Microsoft was converting a non-profit safety organization into a for-profit product company with a safety veneer, that the openness implicit in its name had become increasingly notional as its most significant research was withheld from publication on competitive grounds. OpenAI's account, rendered through the subsequent behavior of its leadership rather than any formal statement, suggested that the parting was also personal, that Musk had sought a degree of operational control incompatible with a board-governed organization, that his departure was as much about authority as about ideology. Both accounts were probably partially true. What was unambiguously true was that by the time ChatGPT launched in November 2022, OpenAI had become precisely the thing Musk had said it was becoming, a for-profit enterprise, majority-owned in economic terms by Microsoft, generating products of extraordinary capability and market power under the governance of a small group of people whose decisions were accountable to a board structure that had subsequently demonstrated in its November 2023 attempt to fire Sam Altman and its rapid reversal of that decision, a degree of organizational coherence roughly comparable to a student government. The organization Musk had helped found had become, by his analysis, a concentrated AI power center of exactly the kind the founding documents had been designed to prevent. And it was winning. It was setting the terms of the public conversation about artificial intelligence, determining through its product decisions what the world's first experience of transformative AI would feel like, shaping through its safety messaging the regulatory frameworks that governments were beginning to erect around the technology. It was, in Musk's assessment, the most dangerous kind of wrong, confident, well-resourced, and moving fast. He incorporated xAI in March 2023. The name was characteristically spare, not a name designed to communicate warmth or accessibility or any of the emotional affordances that consumer technology companies typically engineer into their brands, but a designation, almost algebraic, that communicated intention without elaboration. He was explicit about the purpose: to understand the universe. The phrase was grand enough to be dismissed as marketing, and precise enough, if you took it seriously, to be alarming. Musk genuinely had believed for years, had said so in contexts ranging from formal interviews to late-night posts, that the development of artificial general intelligence was an existential risk to humanity, that the probability of a bad outcome was non-trivial, and that the correct response to this assessment was not to stand aside and hope that the organizations building the technology were trustworthy, but to build a competing version under different principles. Whether those different principles were, in practice, sufficiently different from the principles of the organizations he was competing with, whether xAI's approach to safety was meaningfully distinct from OpenAI's, or whether the distinction was primarily rhetorical, was a question that his critics were already asking, and that the organization's products would eventually have to answer. The core conflict Musk faced was the one that confronts every late entrant to a market where the incumbents have been compounding their advantages for years. He was building a large language model in a landscape where OpenAI had GPT-4, where Google had Gemini, where Anthropic, founded by former OpenAI researchers who had left over their own safety disagreements, had Claude, where Meta had released Llama as an open-weight model that the research community had already built a significant ecosystem around. The compute gap was closable with money. And Musk had money, and he had procurement relationships that allowed him to move GPU hardware faster than most. The data gap was different. Training a competitive large language model required not just compute but training data, vast corpora of human-generated text from which the model learned the statistical patterns of language and reasoning. The incumbents had spent years assembling and curating these datasets. xAI was starting from a position that required, in the compressed timeline Musk was imposing, creative solutions to the data problem. The solution was X. The platform that Musk had acquired for $44 billion had among its less discussed assets something that no other AI company could purchase or replicate: a real-time stream of human conversation, debate, humor, argument, and cultural production, generated by hundreds of millions of users across 15 years, indexed and searchable, and reflective of the full spectrum of how human beings actually communicate when they believe they are talking to each other rather than to a machine. Twitter's data had always been valuable. Various research organizations and commercial entities had paid for access to the firehose. But Musk now owned the firehose outright, and the decision to use X's data to train xAI's models, a decision that was made by the accounts of people close to both organizations, with the dispatch that characterized Musk's approach to decisions that aligned his various interests, gave xAI a training resource that was genuinely distinctive. It was also a decision that raised questions from users who had generated that data under a set of terms of service that predated xAI's existence, that the platform's revised terms of service attempted to address with language that critics argued was less transparent than the underlying data arrangement deserved. The revealing action, the moment that functions as a keyhole into the full architecture of what Musk was building and why, was the lawsuit. In February 2024, Musk filed suit against OpenAI and its CEO, Sam Altman, alleging breach of the founding agreement, that OpenAI had violated the contractual and moral commitments of its charter by converting from a non-profit research organization into a for-profit enterprise serving Microsoft's commercial interests rather than humanity's collective benefit. The lawsuit was, in its legal arguments, aggressive. It was also, in its timing and its targets, an act of competitive warfare dressed in the language of principled grievance. Filed precisely as xAI was preparing to launch its first product, precisely as Musk needed a news cycle that positioned him as the responsible actor in the AI landscape relative to the incumbent he was challenging, precisely as the regulatory debate over AI governance was reaching a critical moment in Washington and Brussels, where the framing of that debate, who was the safety-conscious builder and who was the reckless commercializer, had real consequences for the frameworks that would govern the technology. Musk later dropped the lawsuit without explanation and without settlement, which is the legal equivalent of throwing a punch and walking away. The intended effect achieved, the formal proceeding no longer useful. But the intent was legible. He was not primarily trying to win in court. He was trying to establish a narrative, and the narrative was, I helped build this thing to benefit humanity. They betrayed that purpose. I am building the alternative. It was a narrative with enough factual grounding to be credible, and enough selective emphasis to be something other than the complete story, which made it, in the media environment of 2023 and 2024, nearly ideal. The relationship that defined xAI's formation was the one between Musk and Igor Babushkin, the DeepMind researcher he recruited as one of the organization's first employees, and who became, in the compressed sprint toward Grok, its most important technical leader. Babushkin was a researcher of genuine distinction. His work at DeepMind had contributed to some of the most significant advances in reinforcement learning of the prior decade. And his decision to leave a well-resourced incumbent to join a startup that existed at the time of his recruitment, primarily as a set of intentions and a procurement order for GPU chips, said something about the gravitational force that Musk continued to exert on the kind of people he needed most. Babushkin brought with him not just his own capabilities, but a network of researchers for whom his endorsement functioned as a credibility signal, who evaluated xAI not just on Musk's reputation, which was complicated, but on the quality of the people already committed to the project, which was, because of Babushkin's presence, high enough to attract more. The dynamic between Musk and his technical leaders had always followed a pattern. He set the direction, imposed the timeline, generated the resources, and held the ambition at a temperature high enough to prevent the organization from settling for incremental progress when transformative progress was the stated goal. His technical leaders executed, filtered, pushed back where the physics genuinely would not accommodate the schedule, and absorbed the considerable interpersonal cost of operating at the intersection of world-class science and Musk's conviction that the schedule was always, in principle, compressible. Babushkin occupied this position at xAI, and the product that emerged from it, Grok, launched in November 2023, initially available to X-Premium subscribers in the United States, bore the marks of both the talent and the timeline. Grok was not GPT-4. It was not intended to be, or not immediately. It was a first-generation product from an organization that had been incorporated 8 months earlier, and its capabilities reflected that timeline with reasonable honesty. What distinguished it was not raw benchmark performance, where it competed credibly against models of similar scale, but did not surpass the frontier, but temperament. Musk had specified, in the product vision he communicated to the team, that Grok should have a personality, that it should be willing to answer questions that other AI assistants declined, that it should resist the overcautious, hedge-everything, refuse-if-in-doubt disposition that he argued characterized the major models, and that he attributed to a combination of institutional risk aversion and ideological capture. Grok was permitted, even encouraged, to be irreverent. It would engage with edgy topics. It would produce the kinds of responses that made the legal and policy teams at other AI companies lie awake at night. Whether this represented a meaningful philosophical difference in approach to AI safety or a marketing differentiator aimed at the segment of the market frustrated by ChatGPT's refusal policies, was a question that observers answered differently depending on their priors about Musk's motivations. The integration with X was the strategic move that no other AI company could replicate. Grok had access in real time to the full stream of posts on the platform, to the breaking news, the cultural conversation, the market sentiment, the political argument that was unfolding continuously across hundreds of millions of accounts. This gave it a knowledge currency that models trained on static datasets could not match, and it gave X Premium a genuinely differentiated feature that Musk could use in the ongoing effort to convert the platform's attention into subscription revenue. The synergy was real. It was also the clearest expression of what the acquisition of Twitter had actually been about. Not the social media platform, not the advertising business, not even the free speech principles that had provided the public justification, but the data, the distribution, and the position at the center of the real-time human information stream that no amount of money could purchase from scratch, and that Musk had paid $44 billion in a transaction he had tried to escape and then been forced to complete, to own outright. By the end of 2023, xAI had raised $6 billion in its first funding round, at a valuation that reflected not what the company had built, but what the people investing in it believed Musk was capable of building. A bet on trajectory rather than state, on the man's history of willing into existence things that his competitors and critics had argued were impossible until the moment they were not. The researchers Musk was recruiting were among the best in the field. The compute he was assembling, in a Memphis data center he called Colossus, was scaling at a rate that suggested the next generation of Grok would not be a first-generation product from an 8-month-old company, but something that bore a different relationship to the frontier entirely. The incumbents at OpenAI and Google and Anthropic had been given, in the launch of Grok, the clearest possible signal of what was coming. A competitor with the distribution of a social media platform, the data of a real-time human conversation stream, the compute of a billionaire willing to spend without the friction of a board's approval process, and at its center a founder whose relationship with the organizations he was now competing against carried a charge of personal grievance that had been accumulating at compound interest since the day he left a board meeting in 2018 and began the slow, patient, characteristically Muskian process of deciding to build the thing himself. What the incumbents had not yet fully priced into their competitive models was the lawsuit that Musk had dropped without settlement, and the specific clause in OpenAI's corporate restructuring that was still being negotiated, and the question of what happened to the competitive landscape if the organization he had co-founded decided to complete its conversion to a fully for-profit entity, a decision that would trigger, by the terms of several agreements that were still being reviewed by lawyers in offices in San Francisco and Washington, set of consequences that nobody, including the people who had signed the original documents, had fully thought through. Chapter 67. Starlink and Geopolitics, the Ukraine Context. The request arrived the way so many urgent things did in the autumn of 2022, through the compressed, almost casual medium of a tweet. Mikhailo Fedorov, Ukraine's 31-year-old Minister of Digital Transformation, a man who had spent the first weeks of the Russian invasion coordinating drone deliveries and IT volunteer brigades from a bunker somewhere beneath Kyiv, typed his appeal directly into the public timeline, tagging Musk with the directness of someone who understood intuitively that the old architecture of diplomacy had crumbled alongside the apartment blocks in Mariupol. Elon Musk read it on his phone. He almost always read things on his phone, and within hours the first shipment of Starlink terminals was en route. Within days there were thousands. It was, by any reckoning, one of the most consequential logistical decisions made by a private citizen in the history of modern warfare. And it had been made essentially on impulse, in the way that Musk made many of his most significant decisions, swiftly, publicly, and with a confidence that brooked no institutional deliberation. To understand what Starlink meant to Ukraine in those early months, one has to understand what Ukraine looked like from the ground up, not from the satellite imagery that dominated Western news coverage, but from the granular, terrifying experience of a country whose communications backbone was being methodically dismantled. Russian missiles targeted cell towers. Fiber optic lines were severed. The Ukrainian military found itself fighting a 21st-century war, with the communications infrastructure of a country being dragged backward through time. Conventional internet was intermittent at best, non-existent at worst, and the difference between a working data connection and no data connection was, in the most literal sense, the difference between life and death for soldiers trying to coordinate artillery strikes, drone surveillance, and field evacuations in real time. Starlink terminals, compact, portable, capable of pulling broadband signal directly from low Earth orbit, filled that void with a speed and reliability that astonished military commanders who had grown accustomed to bureaucratic procurement cycles measured in months and years. The terminals were passed from unit to unit like sacred objects. They were mounted on the dashboards of pickup trucks. They were dragged into basements and set up beside field hospitals. General Valery Zaluzhny, the commander of Ukraine's armed forces, would later describe Starlink as one of the defining technological advantages of the Ukrainian resistance. He was not exaggerating. But the story of Starlink and Ukraine is not, ultimately, a story of corporate philanthropy or technological triumph. It is a story about power, specifically about what happens when the most consequential infrastructure of a modern conflict sits not in the hands of a government or an alliance, but in the hands of a single man whose moods, whose financial pressures, whose ideological inclinations, and whose late-night Twitter impulses could at any moment reshape the battlefield. This was the tension that would define the entire arc of Musk's involvement in Ukraine. The same qualities that made him capable of rapid, world-altering generosity made him equally capable of decisions whose implications he either could not or would not fully reckon with. By the summer of 2022, the cost of providing Starlink to Ukraine had become a source of friction that Musk made little effort to conceal. SpaceX had donated thousands of terminals and was absorbing tens of millions of dollars in monthly operational costs that the Pentagon had not fully agreed to cover. Musk, who had cheerfully posted the Starlink activation instructions for Ukraine in the first hours of the invasion, began to chafe publicly at what he perceived as an expectation that his company would serve as an open-ended military utility, bearing costs that governments with vastly larger defense budgets seemed content to let him shoulder. There was something characteristically Muskian in this grievance, the simultaneous desire to be recognized as the decisive actor and the resentment at being expected to sustain the role indefinitely. He had swooped in to save the day. He had not necessarily signed up to fund the war. The grievance sharpened into something far more alarming in September of 2022, when Musk published a peace proposal on Twitter, unsolicited and coordinated with any government or military authority, and constructed with the breezy confidence of a man accustomed to solving engineering problems by first principles thinking. The proposal suggested that Ukraine cede Crimea to Russia, accept the results of referenda in occupied territories that Ukraine and virtually the entire international community regarded as illegitimate, and adopt a posture of neutrality. It was, in its structure, a document that mapped almost precisely onto Russian negotiating demands. The Ukrainian response was immediate and visceral. Andriy Melnik, Ukraine's former ambassador to Germany, told Musk in language that required no translation, precisely where he could put his proposal. Zelensky conducted an online poll, asking Ukrainians which version of Musk they preferred, the one who supported Ukraine or the one who now seemed to be charting his own foreign policy, and the results were predictably lopsided. What struck observers who tracked these things closely was not so much the content of Musk's proposal, which could be dismissed as the well-meaning but uninformed, geopolitical musing of a man who had read too many takes and talked to too few generals, but the mechanism of its delivery. He had published it on Twitter. He had asked his followers to vote on the future of a sovereign nation. He had, in effect, inserted the logic of social media engagement, the poll, the ratio, the viral spread, into the machinery of international relations, and seemed genuinely surprised when the machinery did not appreciate the intrusion. The most revealing moment, however, came not with the peace proposal, but with what followed it. In September 2022, as Ukrainian forces prepared a major offensive operation in the waters around Crimea, specifically a drone submarine attack on Russian naval assets at Sevastopol, Musk made a decision that would not become fully public until journalist Walter Isaacson reported it in his 2023 biography. Ukrainian military commanders, seeking to use Starlink connectivity to guide the drone assault, found that the satellites went dark in the critical area around Crimea. The connection simply ceased. Musk had instructed his engineers to ensure that Starlink would not function in that zone. He later explained his reasoning in terms that were, by his own lights, entirely coherent. He believed that a successful strike on the Russian fleet at Sevastopol could provoke a nuclear response from Putin. He had spoken, or claimed to have spoken, to senior Russian officials. He had concluded, through his own private risk calculus, that the operation needed to be stopped. And so he stopped it. Not by calling a hotline, not by alerting the Pentagon, not by raising the matter through any of the formal channels that exist precisely because the stakes of such decisions are too high to be entrusted to individual judgment. He simply turned the satellites off. The Ukrainian commanders were left, in the words of one official, who later spoke anonymously to journalists, feeling as if the gun had been taken from their hands at the moment they were about to fire. The operation was aborted. The drones, without guidance, washed ashore harmlessly. The Russian fleet remained intact. And Musk, from his position somewhere in the stratosphere of American technology and influence, had effectively made a battlefield decision in a war in which he held no rank, no commission, and no accountability to the people whose lives depended on the infrastructure he controlled. The figure who looms largest in any account of this period, the person whose presence clarifies, by contrast, what was missing from Musk's approach, is Gwynne Shotwell, SpaceX's president and the executive who had spent decades translating Musk's volcanic energy into operational discipline. Shotwell understood, as few people in Musk's orbit did, how to hold two truths simultaneously: that Musk's audacity was the engine of SpaceX's success, and that audacity unchecked by process could become something far more dangerous than failure. It was Shotwell who navigated the early conversations with the Pentagon about cost-sharing for Starlink in Ukraine, who tried to build the institutional relationships that would prevent the program from remaining hostage to Musk's shifting moods. She was, in the language of organizational theory, the integrator, the person who converted vision into system. But even Shotwell's considerable institutional authority had limits when Musk decided to act unilaterally. The Crimea decision, by multiple accounts, was not a SpaceX decision in any organizational sense. It was an Elon decision. And Shotwell, who had spent years making Elon decisions workable, could not walk back what had not passed through her hands in the first place. Their relationship, always a study in productive tension, had entered new territory, one in which the stakes of his unilateral action were no longer merely financial or reputational but geopolitical, and the distance between his instincts and her institutional guardrails had become, for the first time, genuinely frightening to those who understood both of them well. What the Starlink episode revealed, with the precision of a laboratory experiment, was the central paradox of Musk's position in the early 2020s. He had built, through genuine genius and extraordinary will, infrastructure so critical that governments could not function without it. Starlink was not a product in the ordinary sense. It was not something that could be substituted or replicated by a competitor in any relevant time frame. It was, in the territories it served, the Internet. And having built that infrastructure, Musk had retained over it a degree of personal control that was without modern precedent. There was no regulatory body that could compel him to restore service in Crimea. There was no treaty that governed his obligations. There was no oversight committee that had approved his peace proposal or his satellite blackout. He operated in a legal and institutional vacuum that was partly the result of the genuine novelty of what he had built, and partly the result of a regulatory environment that had not yet reckoned with the possibility that a single individual could own and could make autonomous decisions about the communications backbone of an active war. American defense officials, who had spent the early months of the invasion celebrating Musk's contribution to Ukrainian resilience, began to use different words in private. Words like dependency. Words like liability. The Defense Department quietly accelerated conversations about reducing the military's reliance on any single commercial provider for critical communications. Senate staffers drafted questions for hearings that were never quite held. The machinery of government, which moves slowly under the best of circumstances, and moves even more slowly when it is trying to figure out how to regulate something that did not exist 10 years ago, was beginning to turn, very slowly, very uncertainly, toward the question of what it meant that Elon Musk now occupied a position in American national security that no private citizen had ever occupied before. Musk, for his part, seemed to oscillate between genuine discomfort at the weight of what he had stumbled into and something that looked from the outside uncomfortably like enjoyment of it. He posted. He sparred. He published his peace proposal and absorbed the backlash with the practiced equanimity of a man who had long ago concluded that the intensity of the reaction was a proxy for the significance of the idea. He was, as he had always been, impossible to shame and nearly impossible to embarrass, which were qualities that had served him well in the early lonely years of building rockets and electric cars against the derision of people who were certain he would fail. Whether those same qualities were adaptive in a man who now held, in his personal satellite constellation, something approaching a veto over the military operations of a sovereign nation at war, that was a question that the autumn of 2022 had raised with uncomfortable clarity, and that no one, including Musk himself, had yet come close to answering. What no one could see, in those months of satellite blackouts and Twitter polls and unsolicited peace plans, was that the acquisition of Twitter, finalized in October 2022 in circumstances that will occupy the chapters that follow, would give Musk not merely a new platform for his geopolitical improvisations, but a megaphone capable of amplifying them to a scale that would make the Starlink controversy look in retrospect like a local disturbance before a much larger storm. Chapter 68. The Cybertruck, Polarizing Utility and the Exoskeleton. The stainless steel caught the light wrong. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the size of the vehicle, though it was immense, not the flat planes of its body, though they seemed to have been conceived by someone who had never once studied the aerodynamic vocabulary of a century's worth of automotive design. It was the light. The Cybertruck didn't absorb light the way a truck was supposed to. It didn't possess the warm, lacquered confidence of a Ford F-150 gleaming on a dealer lot, or the muscular sheen of a Ram 1500 flexing under stadium fluorescence. It threw the light back at you, cold and indifferent, like a slab of raw material yanked from a SpaceX fabrication bay and told at the last possible moment to be a car. Standing on the floor of the Gigafactory, Texas on a November morning in 2023, as the first Cybertrucks rolled toward their new owners in an atmosphere of engineered carnival, confetti chanting employees, Musk himself prowling the stage in a black shirt, the vehicle seemed to radiate a specific kind of challenge. It dared you to decide what it was. Elon Musk had been daring the world to decide what he was for the better part of 2 years. The context in which the Cybertruck arrived for its limited production run in late 2023 cannot be separated from the larger storm Musk had manufactured around himself. 12 months earlier, he had completed his chaotic $44 billion acquisition of Twitter, immediately renamed the platform X, and spent the subsequent year conducting what amounted to a high-visibility experiment in radical institutional destruction. He had fired roughly 80% of Twitter's workforce, reinstated accounts that had been banned for harassment and hate speech, and repositioned the platform with a directness that stunned even his admirers, as a corrective to what he characterized as the suffocating orthodoxies of liberal media culture. His own feed had become a rolling performance, part policy declaration, part troll campaign, part lonely genius dispatch from the mountaintop. He had tweeted anti-Semitic conspiracy material, then apologized, then repeated behaviors adjacent to the original offense. Advertisers fled en masse. The European Union issued warnings. Congressional hearings convened. And through all of it, Musk had seemed, to the frustration of his critics and the delight of his base, utterly unbothered, or at least constitutionally incapable of performing the contrition that the moment demanded. This was the man who now stepped to a microphone to deliver Cybertrucks to their first customers. The electric vehicle market in that autumn of 2023 was itself at an inflection of anxiety. The early euphoria of the EV revolution, the Tesla-led narrative that had rewritten Wall Street's assumptions about the entire automotive industry, had begun to cool against the hard weather of economic reality. Interest rates had climbed. Consumer financing on expensive vehicles had grown painful. General Motors had walked back its EV commitments. Ford was hemorrhaging billions on its electric truck program. Even Tesla, which had spent the year cutting prices in a brutal attempt to defend market share against a new generation of Chinese competitors, was feeling the pressure. The Cybertruck, long promised and long delayed, was supposed to answer something, to declare in the only language Musk truly trusted, the language of audacity, that the future remained his to define. The core obstacle was not, as it might have appeared from the outside, an engineering problem, though the engineering problems were real and they were serious. The obstacle was perception, or more precisely, the collision between the Cybertruck's fundamental nature and the market it was theoretically designed to enter. The American pickup truck is not merely a vehicle. It is, as any automotive anthropologist will tell you, a cultural object of the first order, loaded with signifiers of labor and capability, and a specific strain of self-reliant masculinity that has proven stubbornly resistant to reimagining. The F-150 is the best-selling vehicle in the United States, not because Americans have rationally calculated its utility, but because it embodies something, a story about who its driver is or wishes to be. Musk, who had once said he designed the Cybertruck because he wanted the truck featured in the 1982 film Blade Runner, was offering a counter-mythology. The Cybertruck was not a working man's truck. It was a science fiction prop brought to life, a vehicle whose aesthetic belonged to a future that had not yet consented to exist, whose stainless steel body could not be painted, could not be easily repaired at a conventional body shop, and which required a relationship with its owner that was more maintenance-intensive than early marketing had suggested. The bed, when fully examined, was smaller than that of its primary competitors. The turning radius was, by multiple accounts, extraordinary, not in the desirable sense. And yet, the waiting list, at various points in the vehicle's pre-production life, had exceeded 1 million reservations. There is a particular quality of Musk's genius, and genius is the right word, whatever reservations one brings to the man, that resists ordinary analysis. He operates on a theory of desire that is orthogonal to conventional market research. He does not ask what people want. He decides what people should want, constructs the object of that desire with a showman's ruthlessness, and then waits for reality to catch up with his vision, or for the whole structure to collapse, and seems genuinely content to accept either outcome as data. At the Cybertruck delivery event, when a reporter asked him whether he was concerned about the vehicle's polarizing aesthetics, he answered with the blunt assurance of a man who has confused his own stubbornness for prophecy. He said that the people who loved it hard, and that was enough. This was not a business answer. It was barely even an honest answer, in the sense that a vehicle requiring mass-market sales could not mathematically sustain itself on the passion of superfans alone. But it was a revealing answer, a keyhole into the operating system beneath the performance. Musk has always believed, at Tesla, at SpaceX, at X, that the intensity of a smaller commitment is worth more than the breadth of a moderate one. He builds for the convert, not the curious. The Cybertruck was the physical expression of a philosophy, that the future belongs to whoever is most willing to look strange in the present. Franz von Holzhausen had been standing slightly apart from the spectacle, as was his custom. The relationship between Musk and Tesla's chief designer, a Pasadena-raised former Mazda and Volkswagen stylist who had joined Tesla in 2008, in its earliest perilous days, had evolved over 15 years into something that defied easy categorization. Von Holzhausen was the quiet instrument through which Musk's aesthetic instincts were translated into manufacturable form. He was, in the vocabulary of their collaboration, the one who made the visions real without making them rational. Where Musk was combustible and declarative, von Holzhausen was patient and precise. Where Musk would sketch something on a napkin and call it finished, von Holzhausen would spend months engineering the emotional content of a surface curve. Their relationship had been tested, as all close creative partnerships are tested, by the Cybertruck's extraordinarily protracted development cycle. The vehicle that von Holzhausen had helped design in 2019, its stainless steel exoskeleton, its straight-edge silhouette, its deliberate rejection of every automotive styling convention accumulated since the post-war period, had required nearly 4 additional years to reach production. During those years, the world had changed profoundly, and there had been quiet internal debates about whether the design, locked into its steel skin, still made strategic sense. Von Holzhausen had held the line. So had Musk. And standing now in the Gigafactory, watching the trucks roll toward customers who had waited years for this moment, the two men shared something that was not quite triumph. Triumph would have been premature, given how much remained uncertain, but was at least the deep satisfaction of the builder who has refused to relent. The stainless steel itself deserved its own paragraph in any honest accounting of the Cybertruck's meaning, because the material was not incidental to the object. It was the argument. Musk had chosen cold-rolled stainless steel, the same alloy used in the Starship rocket, because he believed it was stronger and more durable than the stamped steel of conventional trucks, resistant to dents and corrosion in ways that conventional automotive materials were not. The engineers who worked the problem discovered, as engineers always discover with Musk's more theatrical instincts, that the material's advantages carried corresponding liabilities. Stainless steel work hardens rapidly during forming, which meant the complex curves beloved of contemporary automotive design were largely unavailable. The Cybertruck's geometry, those flat planes and hard angles that read to most observers as aggressively futuristic, were in significant measure a response to material constraint. What appeared to be pure aesthetic vision was also, quietly, a workaround. This was not hypocrisy. It was Musk's fundamental method: to find a constraint, reframe it as a design principle, and sell the result as intention. It is the method of every great showman, and it requires a very specific kind of conviction, the kind that cannot distinguish between believing in your work and needing everyone else to believe in it. The deliveries proceeded. The crowd inside the Gigafactory cheered. Owners photographed themselves beside their new trucks with the particular expression of people who have invested not just money, but identity in a purchase. On social media, the coverage split immediately along the familiar fault lines of the Musk era. Passionate defenders producing elaborate videos documenting the truck's torque and its stainless steel's resistance to a sledgehammer blow. Passionate critics cataloging its turning radius, its charge time, its early reports of panel gaps and water intrusion. Its fundamental question of what, exactly, a person who owned a ranch in Montana and needed to haul irrigation pipe was going to do with a vehicle that couldn't visit a conventional body shop. Both camps, as always in the theater of Musk's products, were partially right. Both camps were also, in the way of all partial truths, missing something. What they were missing was that the Cybertruck was not primarily a truck. It was an argument. Musk had built it to demonstrate that the constraints everyone accepted as permanent, in automotive design, in material science, in the cultural grammar of what a truck was allowed to look like, were constraints only if you consented to them. The vehicle's polarizing effect was not a bug in this formulation. It was evidence that the argument was being heard. The people who hated it because it refused to be what they had decided a truck should be. The people who loved it for exactly the same reason. Whether the argument would survive contact with the quarterly reports, with the warranty claims, with the slow arithmetic of mass adoption, that was a different question, and it was a question that would take longer to answer than a single delivery event could resolve. Tesla's production targets for the Cybertruck were ambitious, in the way that all of Musk's targets were ambitious, which is to say they were set in a reality that had not yet negotiated the terms of its own existence. The factories would have to scale. The supply chains would have to perform. The stainless steel, which aged and marked differently than painted surfaces, would have to prove itself in the hands of owners who drove in rain, parked in sun, and occasionally backed into things. For now, in the fluorescent light of the Gigafactory, the trucks were real. They existed. They caught the light wrong and threw it back, cold and indifferent. And Musk stood on the stage with the expression of a man who has just shown you something you will spend the next decade deciding how to feel about. Out in Hawthorne, California, in the low-slung buildings where SpaceX was preparing its next Starship test, and in Austin where xAI, Musk's newest company, the one he had founded to build an artificial intelligence that he believed all other AI developers were getting dangerously wrong, was beginning to assemble its supercomputing cluster. The next arguments were already being loaded into the chamber, and the world, still deciding what to make of a truck that looked like the future refusing to apologize, had not yet begun to understand how loud the next report would be. Chapter 69. Legal Challenges and Regulatory Scrutiny at X. The subpoena arrived on a Tuesday, the way most catastrophes do, without ceremony, without the dramatic lighting that the gravity of the moment seemed to demand. Somewhere in the legal department of X's San Francisco headquarters, a junior attorney would have logged it, assigned it a file number, routed it through the chain of command that Musk had so aggressively thinned over the preceding months. By the time it reached anyone with the authority to respond meaningfully, it had already been joined by others. The European Union's regulatory apparatus, which moved with the deliberate patience of an institution that had been building its infrastructure of digital governance for years before Musk had ever turned his attention to social media, was not issuing warnings anymore. It was issuing demands. And in Brasilia, a Supreme Court justice named Alexander de Moraes had arrived at a conclusion that no regulator in a major democracy had yet been willing to formalize: that X, in its current form, under its current management, was operating outside the boundaries of Brazilian law, and that the appropriate response was not a fine or a compliance order but a shutdown. A complete national shutdown. In the corridors of democratic governance across 3 continents, the question being asked about Elon Musk's platform had shifted quietly but fundamentally from whether X should be regulated to whether it could be. Musk characteristically was on his phone. The year 2023 had deposited him at a peculiar apex of simultaneous influence and institutional hostility. No private citizen in the modern era had assembled a portfolio of consequence quite like his: electric vehicles reshaping global automotive markets, rockets restocking the International Space Station and competing for Department of Defense launch contracts, a social media platform used by heads of state, journalists, intelligence services, and 250 million ordinary people to conduct the primary arguments of the age, and now an artificial intelligence company that he had seeded with his own capital and positioned with characteristic grandiosity, as the last responsible actor in a field he believed was careening toward catastrophe. The power was real. So was the exposure. Every institution that had ever depended on the belief that technology companies were ultimately governable, that they could be brought to heel through litigation, through regulation, through the accumulated weight of democratic accountability, was now measuring itself against a man who had publicly and repeatedly declared that accountability, as traditionally practiced, was a form of censorship dressed in procedural clothing. The lawsuits came from multiple directions at once, and their cumulative architecture told a story about the particular kind of chaos Musk had chosen to administer. Former employees, thousands of them, shed in the weeks following the acquisition with a speed that employment lawyers across the country described as legally unprecedented, had organized into a rolling series of arbitration claims and class action suits alleging that promised severance had been withheld, that legally mandated notice periods had been violated, that the mass terminations had fallen disproportionately on workers whose protected characteristics made their dismissal actionable under federal statute. The numbers were not trivial. The Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act alone, which required 60 days' notice before mass layoffs, carried penalties that, multiplied across the scale of Twitter's workforce reduction, represented an exposure in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Labor attorneys who had spent careers handling the aftermath of corporate restructurings described the Twitter situation as unlike anything they had encountered, not because mass layoffs were unusual, but because the speed and public visibility and apparent indifference to legal formality made the liability almost impossible to contain quietly. Musk's response to the litigation was consistent with his response to most forms of institutional friction. He accelerated. Where another CEO, advised by counsel and attuned to the mathematics of reputational risk, might have settled quickly and quietly and moved on, Musk treated the lawsuits as a theater in which his broader argument about the dysfunction of establishment institutions could be performed. X's legal team, itself depleted by the same attrition that had hollowed out every other department, fought arbitration demands by arguing that the sheer volume of claims, thousands of individual arbitration filings, each requiring a separate filing fee from X under the terms of the company's own arbitration agreement, constituted an abuse of process. There was a bitter irony here that did not escape the labor lawyers on the other side. X was now arguing, in effect, that its own dispute resolution mechanism was being weaponized against it by the very workers that mechanism had been designed to disadvantage. A federal judge in San Francisco, reviewing the arguments with the expression of someone being asked to adjudicate a situation that the law had not quite anticipated, found herself navigating territory where the rules were genuinely unclear. The European front was more structured, and in some ways more dangerous to the long-term operation of the platform, precisely because it was less improvised. The Digital Services Act, which the European Union had spent years constructing, and which had come into force for large platforms in the summer of 2023, represented the most comprehensive attempt by any major democratic body to impose systematic obligations on social media companies, requirements around content moderation transparency, algorithmic accountability, the handling of illegal content, and the preservation of data for regulatory audit. X had been designated a very large online platform under the DSA, which placed it under the direct supervision of the European Commission and subjected it to fines of up to 6% of global annual turnover for non-compliance. The Commission had opened a formal investigation into X in December of 2023, focused on whether the platform was doing enough to combat the spread of illegal content and disinformation, and whether its systems for content labeling and user reporting met the DSA's standards. Musk's posture toward the European regulators tracked his posture toward regulation generally, which was to treat the entire enterprise as an expression of political bias rather than legitimate governance. When Thierry Breton, the EU's Internal Market Commissioner and the architect of much of the DSA's enforcement architecture, engaged in a series of public exchanges with Musk over X's compliance obligations, the dialogue took on the quality of a collision between two worldviews that shared no common premises. Breton spoke the language of institutional responsibility, of democratic accountability, of the obligation that platforms bearing the infrastructure of public discourse owed to the societies in which they operated. Musk spoke the language of a man who had decided that the institutions themselves were the problem. He described the DSA's requirements as censorship by bureaucratic proxy, as a mechanism by which European governments could launder their suppression of inconvenient speech through the formal machinery of platform regulation. His public tweets about the EU's regulatory actions drew tens of thousands of responses, most of them supportive, which he appeared to interpret as democratic validation of his position, a reading of the data that his critics found either disingenuous or alarming, depending on their assessment of whether he understood the distinction between audience and electorate. The keyhole moment, the single action that, held up to the light, illuminated the whole of Musk's legal predicament and his response to it, came not in a courtroom or a regulatory filing but in a post on X itself. In August of 2023, following the eruption of violent riots in the United Kingdom, triggered by the spread of misinformation about the identity of an attacker in Southport, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government asked social media platforms to take urgent action against posts inciting racial violence. Musk's response, posted publicly to his own platform and visible to its entire global user base, was to describe Britain as heading towards civil war, to amplify accounts that had been identified as spreading disinformation about the attacks, and to add, with a breezy combativeness that seemed almost performative in its disregard for consequence, that the British government's approach to platform moderation constituted a form of state tyranny. He addressed Starmer directly, using the diminutive that suggested contempt, and invited him to sue. The British Home Secretary and the Metropolitan Police issued formal statements. Regulatory bodies in multiple EU member states updated their files. And somewhere in the Commission's Enforcement Division, the documentation that would eventually support the DSA investigation grew several pages longer. What made this moment revealing was not the political content of Musk's position, which was consistent with views he had been expressing for months. What made it revealing was the medium. He was using his own platform, whose legal jeopardy was in significant part a consequence of his approach to content moderation, to generate new content that would create new legal and regulatory exposure, in real time, apparently without counsel or deliberation, in a way that seemed to derive genuine satisfaction from the transgression itself. This was not the behavior of a man who believed he was losing. It was the behavior of a man who had decided that the conflict was the point, that the willingness to sustain institutional hostility was itself the proof of the principle he was defending. Linda Yaccarino had been hired as X's CEO in June of 2023, in what the company presented as a stabilizing appointment, a signal to the advertising market and to the regulatory community that professional management had arrived to provide adult supervision over the chaos that the acquisition had generated. Yaccarino was a serious person, a longtime NBC Universal advertising executive who had spent her career building relationships with the brands and agencies whose spending decisions determined whether a media platform was viable. She came with credibility that Musk, operating as de facto CEO while simultaneously running Tesla, SpaceX, and xAI, could not manufacture for himself. Her hiring had produced a brief thaw in the advertiser exodus, a momentary sense that X might be navigating towards something recognizable as a stable business. The relationship between Yaccarino and Musk was, from its earliest days, a study in the gap between organizational chart and operational reality. On paper, she ran the company. In practice, Musk ran the company the way he ran all his companies, through a combination of direct intervention, public declaration, and the constant implicit reminder that ultimate authority resided with the man whose name was not on any title but whose decisions were not subject to appeal. Yaccarino conducted herself with the disciplined professionalism of someone who had decided that her own effectiveness depended on maintaining the performance of an authority she did not fully possess. She gave interviews. She attended advertising conferences. She made the case repeatedly and with evident conviction that X was an evolving platform working actively toward brand safety standards that would satisfy the market. And then Musk would post something about civil war in Britain, or amplify an account that had been banned from every other major platform, and the calls from agency holding companies would resume. And Yaccarino would absorb the damage with the expression of someone who had signed a contract she was only now fully reading. By late 2023, the legal exposure had not resolved, it had stratified. The employment litigation ground forward through arbitration and federal court, on timelines measured in years. The EU investigation proceeded with bureaucratic thoroughness, accumulating documentation and issuing information requests that X's reduced legal department struggled to answer at the required pace. And in Brazil, the situation had escalated to a point that no one in the global technology industry had anticipated. Justice de Moraes, following X's refusal to comply with court orders requiring the removal of accounts he had identified as spreading disinformation about Brazilian elections, had ordered the platform completely blocked within Brazilian territory. Approximately 22 million Brazilian users, who had used the platform to conduct the ordinary commerce of public life, politics, journalism, entertainment, commerce, found themselves unable to access it. X had responded not with compliance but with defiance, closing its Brazilian offices before the order took effect, and characterizing the shutdown as a threat to global free expression. Musk had posted about it extensively. The platform, in Brazil at least, was gone. What the legal architecture of 2023 revealed, for anyone willing to read it carefully, was that the question of whether Elon Musk's vision of a platform without institutional accountability could survive contact with the regulatory regimes of modern democracies had not been answered. It had merely been deferred, pushed into courts and compliance processes and diplomatic channels that operated on timescales longer than a news cycle, longer than a quarterly report, longer than the attention span of any audience Musk had ever cultivated. The bills, in every sense, were accumulating interest, and the governments that had issued them had demonstrated, in Brazil at minimum, that they possessed tools beyond the warning letter, and that somewhere in Washington, where the Federal Trade Commission had been watching the Twitter acquisition and its aftermath with an institutional attention that had not yet fully declared itself, a different kind of reckoning was being quietly and methodically prepared. Chapter 70. The Siobhan Zalice Reveal, Expanding the Family. The court filing was 11 pages long, and it had been designed with the particular care that expensive lawyers bring to documents they hope no one will ever read, to be invisible. Filed in a Texas probate court in late 2021 and processed in the first days of 2022, it requested a name change for two infants, twins, born in November of the previous year, so that they might carry their father's surname alongside their mother's. The request was granted with the administrative efficiency of a courthouse that processes dozens of such filings each month, and the record was sealed. The father listed on the documents was Elon Musk. The mother was Siobhan Zalice. In a different era, or in the life of a different man, the matter might have ended there, folded into the private architecture of an unconventional arrangement, known to those who needed to know it and invisible to everyone else. But the era was 2022, and the man was Elon Musk, and the journalist Ashley Vance was not the only reporter who had learned that the sealed records of Texas probate courts were, under the right circumstances, not entirely sealed. When the story broke in July of that year, published with the careful documentation of reporters who understood that the subject's legal resources were not theoretical, Musk was in the middle of attempting to escape his $44 billion agreement to purchase Twitter, and the world was already watching him with an attention so total and so fractured that the revelation of 2 more children landed not with the weight of genuine scandal, but with the quality of a detail added to a portrait that was already almost too complicated to hold in the mind at once. He did not issue a statement. He was not the kind of man who issued statements. The summer of 2022 was, by any reasonable accounting, the most operationally exposed period of Musk's public life to that point. The Twitter acquisition, announced in April with the impulsive certainty of a man who had decided at the poker table to push all his chips to the center, then spent the subsequent months trying to figure out how to retrieve them, had metastasized into a legal confrontation with the platform's board that was consuming the attention of Wall Street, the technology press, and a significant portion of the legal establishment. Musk had claimed, through filings that his own attorneys appeared to construct with some discomfort, that Twitter had misrepresented the number of bot accounts on its platform, and that this misrepresentation constituted grounds for terminating the deal. Twitter's legal team had filed suit in Delaware Chancery Court to compel completion of the acquisition, and the presiding judge, Chancellor Kathleen McCormick, had made clear in early hearings that she viewed the case with the skepticism of a jurist who had read the contract carefully and found Musk's exit arguments unpersuasive. The trial date had been set for October. The financial exposure, if the court-ordered specific performance, was the full purchase price. Simultaneously, Tesla's stock had declined precipitously from its 2021 peaks, shaving hundreds of billions of dollars from the company's market capitalization, and more immediately relevant, from the value of the collateral Musk had pledged against the personal loans he had taken to fund his Twitter stake. SpaceX was preparing for Starship's first integrated flight test, a program that had consumed years and billions, and whose outcome was genuinely uncertain. Neuralink, the neurotechnology company Musk had co-founded in 2016 with the ambition of building a direct interface between the human brain and computational systems, was navigating its own regulatory challenges with the FDA around its proposed first human clinical trials. It was within the structure of Neuralink, in the peculiar hothouse of a startup where brilliant people work at inhuman hours toward goals that most of the world considers science fiction, that Musk's relationship with Siobhan Zaliz had developed. Zaliz was not a peripheral figure in Musk's professional world. She was, by every account of people who had worked alongside her, one of the more formidable operational intellects in the extended ecosystem of his companies. A Yale graduate who had worked at Bloomberg and then Fisher Asset Management before arriving in the technology sector, she had joined Tesla's energy division, moved into a role at OpenAI when Musk was still a founding backer of that organization, and eventually landed at Neuralink in a senior leadership capacity that made her, in practical terms, one of the handful of people closest to the company's core decision-making. She was, in the vocabulary that Silicon Valley uses to canonize its high performers, a builder, someone who could translate visionary ambition into executable process, who could hold the complexity of a frontier technology program in her head while simultaneously managing the human systems required to advance it. She was also, by mid-2022, the mother of Musk's 8th and 9th children. The core tension that the revelation exposed was not, despite the framing that much of the coverage initially attempted, primarily a personal one. The personal dimensions, the questions about the nature of Musk's relationships, about the conditions under which 2 people who work together in a high-intensity professional environment arrive at a decision to have children together, about what Zaliz's own account of those circumstances might be, were real, and they deserved the careful treatment that their complexity demanded. But the deeper conflict, the one that would echo through the months following the revelation, was structural. Musk was the ultimate authority over Neuralink. Zaliz was a senior executive at Neuralink. The children they had produced together had been born, and the court filings seeking to change their names had been submitted, and the entire arrangement had been formalized without any public disclosure of the kind that corporate governance frameworks exist to require. The question of whether a CEO who had fathered children with a senior employee at a company he controlled had obligations to the company's other employees, to its investors, to the regulatory bodies overseeing its work, that extended beyond the personal, was not a question that Musk's public posture acknowledged. His silence on the subject was itself a form of communication. In the days following the story's publication, Musk continued to post on Twitter at his customary volume, commentary on the acquisition litigation, observations about inflation and monetary policy, jokes in the register of terminally online irony that his followers had learned to decode without reference to the revelation. This was consistent with a pattern that had defined his approach to personal exposure throughout his public life. He had spoken in interviews and on his own feed with surprising candor about his childhood, about the psychological damage inflicted by his father Errol, about his struggles with what he described as the difficulty of simply being present in ordinary life. He had discussed his use of ketamine with a frankness that would have ended lesser careers. But the specific terrain of his romantic and familial arrangements, the simultaneous relationships, the children born to different mothers across overlapping windows of time, he navigated with a conspicuous silence that was, in its own way, more revealing than disclosure would have been. He was willing to be known as difficult, as visionary, as occasionally cruel, as a man whose relationship with ordinary human convention was at best intermittent. He was not willing to submit the architecture of his private life to the accountability he otherwise claimed to welcome. The keyhole into his character came not from the revelation itself, but from a remark he had made months earlier, in a different context, that acquired new resonance in its light. Responding to concerns about global population decline, a subject he returned to with the consistency of a man who had elevated a demographic anxiety into a personal philosophical commitment, Musk had said publicly and without apparent embarrassment that he was trying to do his part. The comment had been received at the time as a characteristic provocation, a piece of billionaire transgression performed for the audience that finds such performances clarifying. Read alongside the court documents from the Texas probate court. It became something more complicated. Evidence that Musk had developed a framework in which his own reproductive choices were not merely personal decisions, but expressions of a civilizational responsibility that placed them, at least in his own accounting, beyond ordinary social judgment. He was not having children haphazardly. He was, in the cosmology he had constructed around his own significance, populating the future. The grandiosity of this self-conception was either a form of genuine philosophical conviction or a very sophisticated rationalization, and the honest answer was probably that it was both simultaneously, which is how the most consequential self-deceptions always work. Zelise herself remained largely outside the public conversation following the revelation, which was consistent with the asymmetry that defined the situation. She had not chosen public life in the way that Musk had chosen it, had not built a persona around transgression and declaration, had not cultivated an audience of millions for whom her daily opinions were content. She was a private person who had made choices in the specific context of a professional relationship with an extraordinarily powerful man, whose full complexity was not available to outside assessment. The people who knew her professionally described someone who remained committed to Neuralink's mission, who continued to show up and do the work with the same focus that had made her valuable before the revelation made her famous. What the arrangement cost her privately, how she navigated the particular pressures of her position in the months following July 2022, whether the relationship with Musk evolved or contracted or remained in some form stable under the weight of public attention, these were questions that belonged to her, and she did not answer them publicly. What could be assessed was the relationship's professional dimension, which continued to function inside Neuralink with the pragmatic durability of an institution that had more pressing concerns than the personal lives of its leadership. The FDA was evaluating Neuralink's application for its first human clinical trial, a regulatory process that would ultimately result in approval in May of 2023, and that represented for everyone involved the vindication of years of work. Zelise had been part of that work. Her expertise in the operational infrastructure of deep technology development had been genuinely consequential to the company's progress, and the trial's approval was as much a testament to that contribution as it was to the engineering and scientific work of the broader team. Whatever the personal arrangement between Musk and Zelise had become by the time the approval arrived, the professional collaboration had produced something real. The wider public conversation about the revelation had a short half-life, which was itself a function of the era. The same media environment that would have sustained a conventional scandal for weeks, the demands for statements, the calls from advocacy organizations, the television interviews, the congressional inquiries, moved on within days, pulled by the gravitational force of the Twitter litigation and the accumulating news cycle of a year that seemed determined to test the attention span of everyone living through it. Musk had, by this point, generated enough simultaneous controversies that each new one served partly to dilute the others. The revelation about the twins competed for oxygen with the Twitter escape attempt, with the Tesla stock decline, with the ongoing Starship preparation, with a dozen other threads that any single one of which would have been the defining story of a different person's career. By the time the dust settled, the count of Musk's children stood at 9. Nevada Alexander, who had died of sudden infant death syndrome as an infant, the twins Griffin and Xavier, born to his first wife Justine Wilson, then triplets Kai, Saxon, and Damien, also with Justine, then xAI, born to the musician known as Grimes, then xAI Sidriel, also with Grimes, and now the twins with Zalise, who were given the names Strider and Azure. The family, distributed across the specific geography of Musk's professional and personal life, was not a conventional family in any dimension. Not in its scale, not in its arrangements, not in the range of relationships it represented. It was instead another expression of the same fundamental disposition that governed every other aspect of Musk's life. The belief that the normal rules, the ones that most people accepted as the architecture of a livable existence, were constraints he had never agreed to honor. The children would grow up in a world their father was actively reshaping. A world where his satellites provided the communication infrastructure for a war in Ukraine, where his rockets launched the satellites that governments and corporations depended on, where his platform hosted the primary arguments of democratic politics, where his cars were redefining the relationship between personal transportation and the electrical grid. They would grow up famous in the specific way that the children of very public men are famous, known for their existence before they had any existence of their own. And Strider and Azure, the newest additions to a family that had already acquired the quality of myth, would eventually become old enough to search their own names on the platform their father owned, and find there the entire record of the summer when the world learned they existed. A summer when their father was simultaneously fighting to escape a $44 billion contract, preparing to transform global media, and beginning to extend his reach into the territory of the human mind itself, where, in the buildings of Neuralink, a device was being refined that would soon be placed inside a living human skull, and where the question of what Elon Musk was ultimately reaching for was becoming, with each passing month, both more urgent and more genuinely difficult to answer.